Chapter 1. Prologue. Hey, this story might seem familiar to you. This is because it has been stolen from me and reposted half a dozen times on this website. Some of you have even been tricked into paying money for advanced chapters to a plagiarist. You can find the full 122 chapters of this story under the name The Unyielding Stag on questionablequesting.com, hntaIfoundry.com, archiveofourown.com, and scribblehub.com. In the meantime, I'm going to post more chapters up here than are on the plagiarist's webnovel in order to prove I'm the rightful owner. XXX. Robert Baratheon's nostrils flare as he breathes in the scent of smoke, blood, and sweat in the air, before grinning viciously. Victory had never smelled so sweet. That bastard Rhaegar was dead and the tide of battle had turned in their favor the moment that Robert had delivered the killing blow with his warhammer, smashing the rubies right off of the pompous prick's armor in the process. Everywhere he goes, he receives the cheers and praise of the men. Everywhere he goes, he sees the awe and respect in their eyes. Today was the day the Targaryen dynasty fell. It didn't matter that the snakes still held King's Landing nor that the Mad King still lived. This battle had turned into a rout, leaving the loyalist forces all but decimated. The path into the Crownlands was wide open and Robert intended for them to take full advantage of that fact. His own injuries had already been wrapped, and a short post-battle meeting between him and the other rebel lords had already taken place. With Rhaegar Targaryen and Lewin Martell both dead in battle, the most important decision to be made at that meeting had been the fate of Ser Barristan Selmy. One of Ned's bannermen, Roose Bolton, had advocated for Selmy's execution, but Robert had ultimately decided against it. Ser Barristan Selmy was a courageous and honorable knight. He was a man of oaths and loyalty in a world filled with vipers and cowards. Robert couldn't bring himself to allow such a man to be killed in such a way. Instead, he'd pardoned Selmy and even sent his personal maester to make sure that the man survived. Now Robert found himself walking almost aimlessly, not quite sure what he's looking for. Perhaps he simply wishes to revel in his victory some more. Or perhaps he's looking for exactly what he finds. Truthfully, part of him knows that he shouldn't be seeking out base pleasures, not now that Rhaegar is dead and the path to his Lyanna is finally cleared. But Robert is only a man at the end of the day, a man with an able body and needs of the flesh. This and his love for Lyanna was something else entirely. As such, when he catches sight of the woman standing there amidst the carnage, Robert can't help but be immediately taken with her. She wears strange white cloth and doesn't have a single scratch on her, despite her hands being covered in blood and curled into fists at her sides. A battlefield healer. Must be. Women like her were rare, but maesters who were willing to leave their stuffy castles to treat anyone beyond their liege lords after a battle were even rarer. As such, it fell to her type to try and save who they could, more often than not. But even as Robert marks her as a healer in his mind, her eyes meet his and a shiver runs down his spine. The intensity in her gaze makes him feel the need to arm himself for some reason. Like he should take up his warhammer and wield it against her, despite her sex. Moving through the battlefield like she belongs on it, the woman approaches him, her eyes roaming up and down his form before arriving back at his face. You are the one they call Robert Baratheon. Not really a question, more of a statement. Robert chuckles, finding himself liking her instantly. That's right. Robert Baratheon, Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, Lord of Storm's End. Leader of this motley bunch. And you are. The woman in white with her bloody fists tilts her head to the side, gazing up at him knowingly. Does it matter? A toothy grin spreads across Robert's face as he slowly shakes his head. No, it does not. XXX. She leaves him gasping and sore. So much so that when he wakes up the next morning alone in his tent, he can barely move a muscle. Robert can only stare up at the tent's ceiling with wild eyes, remembering the details of the previous night quite vividly. He was a large man, and though he was not ever in the business of hurting women, he was also not in the business of being treated like one either. But this woman, she had strength to her that belied her form. And what a form it was. Once she stripped off those white coverings, he had quickly begun to wonder if she was some sort of healer warrior, just based off of the scarred, corded muscle that had combined with the soft feminine parts of her for a truly strange yet oddly appreciable view. Of course, he hadn't had much chance to ask questions of her. Not when she was so insistent. So needy. Robert had been with lustful women before, but this was different. He'd been with women who knew how to ride a man instead of being ridden before as well, but again, this was different. In truth, he felt like she'd done more damage to him last night than Rhaegar or any of the loyalists had in the battle just hours previous. Robert felt strange about the entire encounter, but he couldn't deny that he'd enjoyed the experience all the same. And multiple times at that. Only, things take a turn for the strange when he finally gets himself out of bed. Requiring a small dose of milk of the poppy to function through the pain and soreness, Robert begins to hunt for the woman he'd bedded the night before. Except, nobody can direct him to where the woman might be. Nobody can even tell him who she was either. It's like she was a ghost. In the end, after hours of fruitless searching, all he has is his memories and the marks she's left on her body to remember her by. It was the strangest, most engaging experience of Robert Baratheon's life, leaving him with so many unanswered questions and a strange yearning for more. But he could not allow himself to be distracted from what needed to be done. In the end, all he could do was rally his forces and continue to push forward. So that this pointless war could end and the Mad King could be brought to justice. So that he could finally have his Lyanna, once and for all. XXX. Robert Baratheon sits alone in a study with naught but despair in his heart and ashen regret in his mouth that no amount of wine seems capable of washing away. They'd won, just as he knew they would. Aerys was dead, slain by his own Kingsguard. Robert has been made king with Jon agreeing to serve as his hand. And yet, none of it means much of anything, does it? After all, Lyanna is dead, located too late in Dorne before the worst could happen. Ned has returned to the north with her body, leaving on bad terms because he was angry over Robert's reaction to the brutal deaths of Rhaegar's wife and Dragonspawn. And Robert finds himself surrounded by snakes dressed in the skins of lions. House Lannister had done nothing during Robert's rebellion, as they're already taking to call it. It had not sided with the rebels, nor had it come to the aid of the Mad King. Until, at the very last moment, Tywin Lannister had brought his army to King's Landing, arriving ahead of Robert's forces. It could have been bad for his side if the Lannister lord didn't intend treachery all along. The moment that King's Landing had opened her gates for the Warden of the West, the city had been ransacked and ravaged. Meanwhile, Tywin's son, Jaime Lannister, had run Aerys through with his sword, the Kingsguard betraying his oaths and killing his liege lord right there in the throne room at the same time that trusted Lannister men had apparently hunted down and slaughtered Elia Martell and her 2 young children. Robert didn't care that the Mad King was dead. He didn't care that the Dragonspawn were dead either. The killing of Elia Martell was poorly done, but truth be told he couldn't even bring himself to care about that so much either. What he did care about was the duplicity of the lions, and the unfortunate truth that he now had to rely on them anyways. He and Jon had had long talks about the issue after Ned brought news of Lyanna's demise and left for the north, but none of those conversations had been remotely satisfying. Robert had put it off for as long as he could, really he had. He'd stalled for as many moons as he could manage, but in the end, it mattered little. The old lion had still gotten his way, for today was Robert's wedding day. Today, he was expected to marry Cersei Lannister and name her his queen. A joining that was supposed to secure his throne and dynasty for generations to come. He should have been excited. Cersei was certainly not ugly. He should have been thrilled. Lannisters were well known for shitting gold and always paying their debts. But none of it mattered without Lyanna. What was the point of being king without her as his queen? Why did it feel like even though he'd won, he'd actually lost? What? CCRACK. Robert startles, eyes widening as something strikes the window behind him. That shouldn't have been possible. This private study on the upper floors of the Red Keep was hundreds of feet above the ground. Whipping around, he freezes in place and just stares in disbelief for several long moments until finally, the person on the other side of the glass speaks. Either open the window or direct me to the closest balcony. Quickly now if you don't want me to just come through the glass. It was her. The woman from the Trident, and a handful of other places besides. That first night with her had not in fact been the last. Even as nobody had been able to track her down or tell him who she was, even as Robert and his army had continued to make their way south towards King's Landing, she'd kept showing up like a bad copper star. Though a woman like her was more of a golden dragon, admittedly. Night after night, she'd come to his bed. Night after night, Robert had felt like he was fighting for his life, even as he experienced pleasures beyond his reckoning. Then, several moons ago, she'd stopped showing up. Vanished altogether, never to be seen again. Shortly after, he'd arrived in King's Landing and found himself too busy to pay any thought to her and the mystery surrounding her. But now, this goes beyond mystery, because the woman is floating there outside of the window. She's hovering in the air like it's nothing, and more than that, she has a bundle nestled in one arm, pressed to her exposed chest. Robert's eyes widen as he belatedly recognizes the bundle for what it is, an infant. A child. In the end, he has to direct her to the nearest balcony. The window in the study is too large and does not open. Though there is now a crack in its surface from the rock that she had thrown at it all too casually. As she lands on the balcony, the young king of the Seven Kingdoms doesn't know whether to stare at her or the baby she's holding in the crook of her arm. Is he? You are the king now, are you not? I watched as they crowned you. You rule these lands, these 7 kingdoms, yes. Robert's mouth opens and closes for a brief moment before he finally, hesitantly nods. Yes, I do. I am, set to be married later today. He fears for a moment that she will take that poorly, but the woman just scoffs. That does not matter to me. This one is for you. Just like that, she hands over the baby. Robert opens his mouth to confirm his parentage, only for the question to catch in his throat the moment he sees the boy's tousled black locks and blue eyes. He is Robert's, beyond a shadow of a doubt, he is of Robert's blood. A base-born bastard, but then Robert should have expected no less given just how much the woman had extracted from him. I don't understand. Who are you? You've never even given me a name. Scoffing again, the impossible woman crosses her arms over her chest. You do not need my name. You should not be asking who I am, but rather what I am. And what I am, is a Viltrumite. I am not of your world. I come from the heavens, as you primitives might say. A Viltrumite. The heavens. She's an agent of the divine. You were sent by the 7 to ensure my victory then. Or to judge whether I was worthy of kinghood. But the woman, the Viltrumite, just scoffs again. No. I am not of your gods. I come from beyond the stars. It is of little importance to one such as you. What matters is the boy. He is part Viltrumite. Robert purses his lips together, looking down at his son as the weight of all of this comes down on his shoulders. In the end, he finds himself blurting out the truth, blunt honesty spilling from his lips. I will not be able to claim him as my own. He is a bastard. He will not bear my family name, nor will I be able to raise him here. Perhaps you should take him back because I cannot be the father he needs. The woman stares at him for a long moment. Bastard. Family name. Father. Do you think I care about any of that? These words are meaningless. The boy is of Viltrumite blood. He will be a warrior, a soldier, a fighter. I care not where you put him. He cannot come with me. His place is here on this world, where maybe in a few decades he will be able to make something of this misbegotten and backwards planet. She flicks her hand out almost contemptuously, a sneer on her lips. Send him away for all I care. Place him in the harshest environment imaginable and he will either succumb or surpass expectations. Do as you will with him so long as you neither try to kill him nor order him killed. Understood. Taken aback by the complete lack of maternal instincts, Robert slowly nods, his mouth opening to ask the first of a million questions. Unfortunately, he never gets a chance. The moment he signals even the barest form of assent, the woman overrides him with one last message. Good. I'll be back eventually to check on the boy's progress. Perhaps 100 years. By that point he'll either have made some sort of headway or be dead, in which case I'll simply start over. Goodbye, pitiful ruler of a pitiful continent on a pitiful planet. She's gone a moment later and Robert barely registers that she's left by going straight up before she's completely out of sight. His eyes squint upwards, trying to follow her, but she quickly becomes a distant dot before vanishing from view altogether. He's still staring up at the sky when John's voice reaches him a moment later. Robert, what are you doing out there? The wedding starts soon. How does one even begin explaining what he just experienced? Robert's mouth opens and closes, but in the end he shows John instead of telling. The hand of the king's eyes shoot wide open when he sees the infant in Robert's arms. Is that a child? Robert, where did he come from? It's a good question. One that Robert has no intentions of answering lest his father figure start to believe he's gone just as mad as his predecessor. Instead, Robert swallows hard and forces a cool expression onto his face. He's mine, John. My firstborn son, a bastard, of course. John's face goes through a variety of expressions that might very well have been amusing if these were different circumstances. In the end though, Robert recognizes the look in the older man's eyes quite well. Before the lecture can begin, he cuts it off at the knees. He can't stay here, of course. The new wife wouldn't like it, I'm sure. Make arrangements to have him sent to the Vale, please. Let him be raised there in whatever manner you see fit, John. As for a name, call him Axel. Axel Stone, since he'll be of the Vale. Technically it should have been Axel Waters for the Crownlands, but it wasn't like Robert really knew where the woman had given birth to him anyways. And giving him the name Stone would hopefully offer an extra layer of protection from those who might wonder about his identity. His hand looks poleaxed by Robert's orders as he hands the baby over. It's clear that Jon is shocked by Robert's maturity in this moment, having been expecting to have to tell the new king he couldn't possibly keep the boy by his side. Robert wasn't an idiot though. He knew that full well. These lions he'd been forced to surround himself with since becoming king, he didn't trust them within 100 feet of his son. No, Axel would be safer in the Vale. Setting aside all of the insane things his mother had said and done, the boy would be better off there. Robert was sure of it. See it done, Jon. Giving the shocked man a pat on his shoulder and a tired smile that doesn't quite reach his eyes, Robert leaves his hand behind still holding the baby and begins making his way towards his executee heir, his wedding. It's the last time he'll ever see the boy. That's probably for the best, all things considered. XXX. It's all his fault, in the end. His death. Their deaths. As time seems to slow in the pivotal moment, Robert's last clear thought is that it's all his fault. If only he hadn't done this. If only he hadn't done that. His first mistake was definitely allowing himself to sober up long enough to show interest in his children on that fateful morning. After decades spent in a drunken stupor, Robert Baratheon, first of his name, King of the Andals and the First Men, had come to breakfast feeling surprisingly clear-headed for the first time in longer than he could remember. It was there, at breakfast, that Robert had asked his sons and daughter what they'd been up to of late in what even he recognized as a very rare display of interest. All three of them had immediately gone quiet until Robert had asked again with insistence and some forced levity in his voice. That was when Tommen, sweet innocent Tommen, had piped up to tell his father that he'd been exploring recently. Adventuring, that was the word he'd used. And Robert had been intrigued enough to ask for more details. When he found out that Tommen had started slipping his minders to go exploring tunnels underneath not just the Red Keep but even out into the greater city, Robert had been enthused. Now that sounded like the kind of trouble him and Ned had got up to back in the day. His oldest son Joffrey just had to make a snide comment though of course, and so when Robert decided that Tommen would take him with him on the next adventure, he'd also decided Joffrey was coming as well. All three of them, along with something like half of the Kingsguard, going underground to see exactly what sort of treasures Tommen had uncovered. Cersei hadn't been happy about it, of course. His queen had scowled and been just shy of screeching as she tried to head off what she deemed to be a foolish and dangerous expedition. Robert had brushed her concerns off though as the wailings of a weak woman. He had certainly come to regret that, hadn't he? Tommen had led them under the Red Keep, and then into tunnels that took them further from the castle and under the city itself. Robert had been enjoying himself immensely as he bonded with his youngest son, even as his eldest made an ass of himself with every word that left his lips. Until finally, they'd reached a strange door with a strange marking on it that was both familiar and unfamiliar at first. Through that door, Tommen had showed them the treasure he'd found, rows and rows of carefully sealed pots, each of them carrying the same mark as the door, just smaller. Robert had picked up one of the pots before asking Selmy to come over, curious if the other man would recognize the marking. Fortunately, the commander of the Kingsguard did. It was the marking of the all-but-defunct Alchemists Guild, an organization that Robert had barely tolerated and never elevated in his time as king. Mostly because they made just one thing and that one thing was incredibly dangerous and volatile. In the same moment that Robert had realized he was holding a pot of wildfire in his hands, he'd heard Tommen whine and Joffrey laugh, only to look over and see his eldest son tossing one of the pots up and down in the air, playing a game where he pretended like he was going to drop it and break it all over the ground at his and Tommen's feet. Perhaps there were other ways Robert could have handled the situation. Perhaps there were ways that they all could have survived with this just being a scarily close brush with death. But in that moment, Robert reacted without thinking. Joffrey. His sharp, reprimanding tone made it clear that he wanted his eldest son to stop what he's doing. Unfortunately, Joffrey's fear of him works against them in the moment, because he jumps in fright, and drops the jar in the process. Time slows down in that moment for Robert Baratheon as everyone starts to react far too late. Nobody can stop it. Nobody can do anything to prevent what happens next. As bright green flames cover the tunnel and fill his vision, the last thought the King of the Seven Kingdoms has, is that it was all his fault. XXX. Chapter 2. Lord Arryn. A.N. Lord Arryn returns to the Vale on a most dire mission. XXX. Under normal circumstances, the Vale's Lord returning after so many years away in King's Landing would be cause for celebration. Certainly there would need to be some sort of ceremony planned, and an announcement at the very least. Someone to say, presenting the Lord of the Eyrie, Defender of the Vale, Warden of the East, and Hand of the King. All those fancy titles. As Jon Arryn rides into the Eyrie's outer courtyard, that doesn't happen. The silence is almost deafening while also being incredibly somber. But the Hand of the King is not perturbed by this in any way. After all, he'd been the one to send word ahead on how his arrival was to be treated. This was not the time for celebration, nor the time for festivities or even ceremony. Dismounting from his horse and handing off the reins to a stable hand, Jon lets out a sigh as Lord Nestor Royce, High Steward of the Vale, steps up and bows his head. Lord Arryn, welcome home. The Vale is yours. Alas, some minor amount of ceremony is impossible to avoid, it would seem. Jon is grateful to Nestor for keeping it short at the very least. The other man has proven to be a capable steward of House Arryn's lands in the long years that Jon has spent as Hand of the King over in King's Landing. It's been more than 2 decades now, as a matter of fact. And it's likely he will be expected to remain High Steward for some time more, all things considered. Thank you, Lord Royce. I only wish my return were under better circumstances. Nestor grimaces at that, a shadow crossing his face. Indeed, there are no smiles to be had in the courtyard on this day. Everyone will have heard the news by this point, despite Jon leaving for the Vale within days of the tragedy. Ravens fly faster than man or horse can move, this has been true since time immemorial. Yes, my lord. We were all shocked to hear about the king's death. And the prince's too. Wildfire, truly. A shudder runs down Jon's spine. He's never considered himself a particularly weak man. The Vale might not be the greatest of the 7 kingdoms, and House Arryn might not be the greatest of the great houses, but they were not known as particularly feeble or craven either. Not in his lifetime, anyways. And yet, just thinking of the corpses and the green flames that lick the ground, Jon Arryn shuts his eyes and lowers his head for a moment in remembrance before nodding. Yes. The late Mad King apparently put enough wildfire beneath the city to burn the entirety of King's Landing to cinders back at the end of the rebellion. We were fortunate he never managed to make good on those terrible plans, but it seems the caches of wildfire lay hidden under the city ever since. Hidden for decades, just waiting for someone to stumble upon them. Lord Royce is not a particularly weak man either. His silence, therefore, is all the more telling as they both stand there for a moment before Jon continues. The excavation efforts were in full swing all across the city when I left. Hopefully by the time I return, most of the wildfire will have been discovered and removal can proceed without further incident. Of course, that didn't exactly change the fact that Robert and his sons were still dead. Which brought Jon to the reason for this visit. The reason why he'd come here straight from King's Landing mere days after Robert's death, making his way to the area as fast as possible. Letting out a sigh, Jon gets down to business. I'm here for the lad, Nestor. Call for him, please. The High Steward of the Vale doesn't have to be asked who the lad is. With Jon's own son back in King's Landing still with Lisa, there's only one lad in the entirety of the Vale who he could even be talking about. A somewhat affectionate grin spreads across Lord Royce's face and he ruefully shakes his head. He hasn't been a mere lad for some years now, Lord Arryn. A man full and truly grown at this point, I reckon. Yes, that was right, wasn't it? Doing the numbers in his head for a moment, Arryn is almost startled to realize how old the young man would be now. How time flies. Of course, Lord Royce isn't a fool. He might not be the most quick-witted man in the 7 kingdoms, but he does all right. Like a candle being lit, his eyes widen slightly as he suddenly understands why Jon would ask after the young man they're speaking of. I don't understand, my lord. He wouldn't be next in line for the throne, would he? Shouldn't it go to one of the king's brothers before a bastard? Jon just sighs and inclines his head. Under normal circumstances, yes. But these aren't normal circumstances. Robert survived the initial blast of wildfire. The High Steward's eyes damn near pop out of his skull at that. What? How? Grimacing, Jon's stomach tries to rebel on him as he's reminded of how Robert had looked afterwards. Joffrey and Tommen had been reduced to truly unrecognizable states, but Robert Barristan Selmy is how. From what we were able to piece together, the princes were at the center of the blast, while the king was a few feet away. The Lord Commander reacted with surprising speed despite his age and endeavored to pull the king behind him in the initial moments as the wildfire started to rage. He partially succeeded, and the ensuing blast threw Robert through a wall where he was covered in enough rubble to avoid the flames. For a moment, Lord Royce's eyes are filled with hope. But that's quickly squashed as he realizes how foolish such a thing would be given what he already knows. You said he survived the initial blast. Jon just nods. He was badly burned and the same stone that saved him from being burnt further also crushed his body in multiple places. In the end, he lived for only an hour or so after they managed to retrieve him from the rubble. Just long enough to gain consciousness. Just long enough. Here, Jon pauses and sucks in a deep breath before continuing on with a solemn tone. Just long enough to tell me he was legitimizing his firstborn bastard son and making him crown prince. There had, of course, been no small amount of shock and surprise over the king's final words when Jon had shared them with the rest of the small council. But Stannis wasn't in the city to take issue and Renly had accepted it with his usual easygoing attitude. In the end, it wasn't as though Myrcella Baratheon was going to be taking up her father's mantle. The moment Jon shared Robert's decree with the others, Axel Stone's legitimization had been completed. He'd become Axel Baratheon, firstborn son of Robert Baratheon, and heir to the Iron Throne. And since Robert had died shortly after, that meant Axel was the new king of the Seven Kingdoms. Jon still didn't know who the boy's mother was, even after all these years. That day when he'd walked in on Robert to make sure the man was prepared for his wedding only to find him holding a babe had been etched into Jon's memory for decades now. Where did the child come from? He'd checked with the serving staff and nobody could tell him of any baby being brought to the king's quarters. Obviously, Jon had done as his king ordered. He'd sent Axel Stone to the Eyrie to be raised by his high steward and the castle staff. Axel Stone had not been told that he was the son of a king or anything like that, but he'd wanted for nothing all the same. Jon had made sure of it on Robert's behalf. The young man had lived a comfortable life. Meanwhile, Robert hadn't laid eyes on the lad again, not since the day of his wedding. However, when it was just the two of them, the king in his hand, he would sometimes ask after Axel. Likewise, Jon had been understanding orders to check in on the boy personally whenever he returned to the Eyrie from time to time for special occasions. Shaking himself out of his reveries, Jon looks to Royce, who seems to be just as contemplative as him at the moment. Nestor. The lad if you will. Or rather, Crown Prince Axel Baratheon. Where is he? That, much to Jon's dissatisfaction, produces a wince from his high steward. Fortunately for his sake, the next words out of Nestor's mouth are agreeable ones. Right. Of course, Lord Arryn. Right this way. Frowning, Jon follows after Lord Royce. He'd intended for the other man to send a servant to retrieve Axel for them, perhaps while he rested his old bones after all that hard travel, but in the end, if the young man is close by, it's no bother really. Except Nestor doesn't lead Jon to Axel. Instead, he leads the Lord of the Eyrie to a small balcony overlooking the majesty of the Vale. On that balcony sits a horn that Jon has never seen before. Nestor, what is this? Rather than answer him, his high steward steps forward, takes the horn in hand, and blows into it first. Jon winces at how loud the sound is, even as it carries out across the Vale's numerous mountain peaks. It's a decent horn, he will admit. But even still, he's growing rather irate at being ignored. Turning to face him, Lord Royce bows at the waist. Sincerest apologies, my lord. But given the urgency of the situation, I thought it best to send out the message before explaining. You see, young Axel has been ranging more and more frequently in the past few years. Jon blinks, a sensation like curdling taking over in his gut as his voice falls entirely flat. Ranging. No doubt hearing his liege lord's clear disapproval, the high steward winces again. As you might recall, Axel has always had a lot of excess energy. Grunting, Jon is forced to nod even as he frowns most severely. Yes, every time he'd visited the lad in his earlier years, it had been rather astonishing just how energetic he was. Axel Stone had seemed to have endless, boundless stamina and enthusiasm for just about everything. And he'd only seemed to gain more energy the older he'd become. Both Nestor and Jon had done their best to instill proper values into the young man. Even if he was just a bastard, he'd absorbed their teachings like a fish to water and proven in desperate need of more direction as time went on. I did write about it in my letters, Lord Arryn. I mentioned that Axel had managed to subdue the mountain clans, didn't I? Wait, what? Jon's head snaps in Nestor's direction, his eyes widening and his nostrils flaring at such mind-boggling news. Excuse me. When was this? Running a hand over his bald skull, the bearded lord thinks for a second. Ah, about 3 moons past, I would say. 3 moons, Jon thinks back and finds himself letting out another sigh. The last several months had been quite trying, he had to admit. Even before the tragedy with the wildfire, Jon had been kept extremely busy by his work as Hand of the King. It wasn't easy being Robert's hand, it never had been, not in all the years and over 2 decades that he'd served the king in such a position. He'd meant to get around to it eventually, but every time he'd been planning on going through his backlog of non-critical correspondence, something else had come up, some emergency, of some sort. Given Lord Royce's long record of loyal service, Jon was willing to accept that this one was on him. Indeed, Jon didn't doubt that if he could somehow magically transport himself back to the Tower of the Hand right this moment, he would be able to find the exact letter that Nestor was talking about, sealed and unread even after all this time. Making sure to keep any true anger out of his voice, Jon waves a hand in the High Steward's direction. Explain, please. Of course. You see, Lord Arryn, young Axel has been getting quite strong and quite fast. His capabilities have only grown in the years since you were last able to slip away for a visit. And as such, his capacity for getting into trouble also started to grow. Nestor sighs, though there's a rueful smile tugging at his lips all the same, like he can't bring himself to be mad. No amount of chores or duties or responsibilities could stop him. He's proven time and time again that he can do the work of 5 men and still be done by midday. Eventually, he asked to be allowed to explore a little bit. I hope that doing so might give him perspective, or maybe just tire him out for once. Dangerous. The thought of the current heir to the 7 kingdoms running around the mountainous regions of the Vale, where mountain clans and large beasts resided, it sent a shiver down Jon's spine. But to be fair to Nestor, it wasn't like either of them had ever thought that Axel Stone would one day become Axel Baratheon and sit upon the Iron Throne. As I said, he managed to terrify the mountain clans so badly that they haven't raided us a single time in the past 3 moons. Nobody is sure exactly what he did to them, how many he had to kill, but there hasn't been even one attack in all this time. When asked, Axel just says that he dealt with them. That didn't make sense. Subdued the mountain clans sounded like the sort of fantasy that someone from outside the Vale might write about. Someone who didn't understand what the mountain clans were, who hadn't lived a single day in the area. There were almost a dozen large, distinct clans of first men living in the mountains of the moon to this day. And dozens of smaller ones besides that, though those tended to be constantly dying out only to be replaced by men splitting off from the larger ones. The mountain clans were not a monolith. They weren't just some united force that you could subdue all at once. So what the hell had Axel done? How in the world had he managed to convince the clans to cease their attacks on the lowlands for 3 entire months? Do not worry, Lord Arryn. When I realized just how flighty Axel was getting, I made a deal with him. If he hears this horn, then he is to come back immediately, no matter what he's doing. Looking at the horn somewhat askance, Jon then stares out from the balcony at the rest of the Vale stretched out in front of them. These are his lands, the lands of House Arryn, and Jon has never felt anything but pride and satisfaction gazing out at them from the eyrie before. This was the first time where he looked out at the amazing vista, and felt nothing but unease. What if he's too far away to hear it, Nestor? The High Steward of the Vale is quiet for a moment before shaking his head. He's always answered the call, my lord. Frankly, I'm not sure he can be too far away so long as he remains within the Vale's boundaries. Jon shoots Nestor a look at that, frowning at the utter confidence in the other man's voice. Despite the incredibly outlandish things that his steward has already told him so far, somehow it feels like Nestor still hasn't told him everything. But in the end, the only thing that mattered was retrieving Axel and taking him back to King's Landing. Nothing else was more important at this point. Which begged the question, where the hell was the heir to the 7 kingdoms right now, and what the hell is he doing? XXX. Poor Jon Arryn. He's already gray-haired, he doesn't need to have it start falling out from the stress. Chapter 3. Axel Stone. Finally get our first MC perspective. Axel Baratheon, or as he knows himself still, Axel Stone. XXX. The mountains are quiet, save for the chill wind moving through the pass. A blind man might mistakenly believe the area to be empty, just from how silent and still it is. He would be wrong though. In point of fact, this part of the mountains of the moon are filled with men and women at the moment. So-called savages, of the greatest among the mountain clans. Stone crows. Burned men. Black ears. Moon brothers. Painted dogs. Some are greater than others, it should be said. Yet all are united in their silence in this moment. Where normally there would be violence with this many clans gathered in one place, nobody dares to raise a hand against one another. Instead, all eyes are on the man standing in their midst. The outsider. Wearing nothing but a thin pair of linen pants that leave little to the imagination, the young man stands at over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered and broad-chested. His black hair is carefully maintained, while his completely smooth face makes it clear he has yet to grow facial hair despite being of similar size and stature to many of the mountain men in the clearing, and bigger and broader than many more. Standing there in nothing but those thin pants in direct defiance to the cold mountain weather, Axel Stone grins as he tilts his head to the side, sweeping his gaze across them all. Well, are you lot just going to stand there all day? Or are you going to come at me already? Finally, 2 men chosen from each tribe begin to take hesitant, cautious steps forward. 10 in total, they come towards Axel without weapons in hand but clad in thick comfortable furs from head to toe. They share looks between one another, old enmity set aside for a brief moment in the face of their common foe. Axel, meanwhile, sets his stance, clenching his square jaw and lifting his arms up. Not to defend, but to grapple, his hands open and his fingers curling like claws as his grin goes all the wider. Come on then. His shout spurs the 10 mountain men into action. The pride of someone from the mountain clans is not to be underestimated. There were some who would call them bandits and outlaws, savages with shoddy weapons and armor. The lords and ladies of the Vale in their stone castles considered them no more than vermin, nibbling at their heels by ransacking local villages and raiding lowland towns. As the 10 big, burly men reach Axel, he meets their charge head-on, roaring as they all slam into him only for the younger man to barely twitch in response. Of course, as large as he is, he can really only block and grapple with 3 or 4 at most. The other 6 quickly surround him, raining blows down for a brief moment on his seemingly unprotected back and neck, even slamming meaty fists into his skull without a care for potential injuring him. They should have been more worried about themselves. The ones stupid enough to aim for his skull rather than the slightly softer parts of him are rewarded with broken fingers as they let out howls of pain. Their own attacks are turned against them by the sheer hardness of his head. Eventually, the 10 men are forced to simply use their combined weight to press down on Axel until they can take him to the dirt, pinning him to the ground. What a sight it must have been from the outside looking in for a single moment. 10 huge, hulking warriors all writhing and squirming on top of one another as they dogpile a man younger than any of them. HRRRAAAAGH. And then the moment passes and mountain men go flying in every direction as Axel launches himself up at the same time as he throws them all off of him. Rising back to his full height, half are flung away in that first moment. They're the lucky ones. The others meet his fists and elbows as he knocks them flat on their asses, one after the other. One unfortunate warrior gets kicked in the chest for his troubles and goes flying back 10 feet to hit the ground hard and not rise again. In less than a minute from start to finish, Axel is the only one left standing. However, not a single man he's just fought is dead. There's definitely a lot of pained groaning and moaning, men sobbing like maidens as they roll back and forth in pain. But he's been careful to moderate his strength. That kick could have gone through the mountain man's chest after all, and it hadn't. For a tense moment, silence reigns once more as the rest of the gathered members of the 5 mountain clans all stare at him quietly. And then. Bahaha. Pay up Chella. I told you he could take 10. Faye. Your stone crows were clearly holding back, Shaga. Oh. You wish to say that to my face. Chella, leader of the Black Ears, does not in fact want to say that to Shaga's face. Grumbling angrily, the mountain chieftain nevertheless hands over payment to the leader of the Stone Crows clan, much to Shaga's immense satisfaction. At least, if the grinning from ear to ear is anything to go off of. Axel just watches the exchange with mild amusement, before sweeping his gaze to the men he'd just gotten done brutalizing. They would all live, more than likely, but that didn't mean some hadn't been crippled by his actions. That was just the cost of doing business in the mountains of the moon, however. That was the cost of seeking a challenge from Axel Stone. Shaking his head, he walks over to his clothes and begins to get dressed again. He'd developed a bit of a reputation among the mountain clans at this point. When High Steward Royce had finally accepted that Axel couldn't stay cooped up in the area any longer and had approved the first of Axel's rangings, he'd been so eager to start cleaning up the Vale. After all, living in the area all his life, Axel had heard tale after tale of the despicable mountain clans and their raiding of poor, innocent small folk of the Vale. And yet, when he brought up fixing the problem to High Steward Royce, the older man had said it wasn't that simple. He'd explained to Axel how difficult it was for proper knights to traverse the dangerous mountain paths of the Vale. Furthermore, the High Steward had told Axel about how the mountain clans had developed an entire culture around avoiding fair fights and honorable combat. Well, no more, Axel had decided. He would stop them, by himself, if he had to. Of course, once he'd actually gotten out here, he'd quickly learned that not all was as it seemed. Sure, the mountain clans were largely savages by the standards of the rest of the Vale, let alone Westeros as a whole, but they were still people. Dumb people by and large, but people all the same. More than that, they respected personal strength of arms above all else. One thing had led to another and, well, it turned out that Axel's crusading was also a great way of making friends with the rough mountain folk. In the end, he'd managed to beat enough of them into submission that they'd stopped their raiding at his command. For months now, it had continued that way, with Axel making frequent trips to visit the mountain folk and keep them on the straight and narrow. Or as much on the straight and narrow as he possibly could. Axel Stone. You are truly worth 10 men. Maybe even more. Join my stone crows and you will never want for women, food, or drink, ever again. Shaga's boastful claim is not entirely exaggerated either, given how some of the Storm Crow women were already making hungry eyes at Axel before their chieftain offered them up, and rather than anger them, all Shaga's words do is prompt more to shoot Axel inviting looks. Strength was extremely attractive among the mountain clans, after all. What? Don't be ridiculous. If he's going to join anyone, he should be joining my burned men. Bah, Tymet, what can you offer him that the Moon brothers cannot? Less fleas for one, Ulf. You take that back. Axel sighs as a fight very nearly breaks out over his theoretical recruitment, and this isn't the first time either. They've practically been begging him to properly join them since he first beat them all down a few months ago. Frankly, he feels that their eyes are too big for their stomachs. Even if he were willing to set aside his rather cushy castle life up at the Eyrie, he wouldn't just join them, he'd conquer them, uniting them and leading them all under his banner. They'd fall in line too, because not a single one of them was his better. Hell, Axel was pretty sure he could take upwards of 50 of them without issue, really. His strength was not that of a normal man, nor was his flesh. He could deal damage with his fists alone that a man with a sword would struggle to do. And he could take blows and strikes that would fell most normal men. He'd been unusual in that way for as long as he could remember. But it wasn't until more recently that Axel had truly been able to test his limits, using the mountain clans as a whetstone to sharpen his skills and see just how strong, tough, and fast he really was. The results. He had yet to find a limit for any of the three, actually. Seeing that the mountain chieftains are all dangerously close to coming to blows, Axel sighs, and brings his palms together in front of him, clapping them hard enough to make the wind pick up and blow through the area, while also creating a loud enough sound that they all cringe and cover their ears. Enough. I'm not joining any of you, you big oafs. In fact, I can't stay much longer. I'm needed back at the Eyrie. The Lord of the Vale is due to arrive from King's Landing today. As if to confirm his words, a distant horn suddenly sounds. Axel is the only one who hears it, his head twitching in the direction of the Eyrie as he inhales sharply. For the High Steward to be calling him back, either Lord Arryn was close by or he was already there. In the end, it didn't really matter which, he needed to. Bah, Lord of the Vale. He ain't my lord. You know what I think of Gak. Crossing the distance between them fast enough that some of those watching blink and miss it, Axel buries his fist in the gut of Ulf, chieftain of the Moon brothers. The big, burly mountain man is lifted a few inches off the ground from the blow, and when Axel pulls his fist back, he drops to his hands and knees, throwing up his breakfast. Looming over him, Axel scowls down at the mountain chieftain. Lord Arryn is a great man. I won't tolerate any disrespect directed his way. Nobody speaks, though some of the other chieftains are grinning cheekily down at Ulf as he suffers for his words. They're definitely a contentious, disunified bunch, these mountain clans. If not for Axel, they'd all sooner kill and spit on one another's corpses rather than meet under truce like this. I have to go now, but I'll try to come visit again soon. Don't worry about sticking around this area. Even if you have to move, I'll just find you again. There's a round of nods at that, everyone more than used to Axel being able to track them down no matter where they went. Unlike the Knights of the Vale, Axel was neither weighed down by armor, nor bogged down by needing a horse. He also didn't exactly need to stick to established paths either, all things considered. Letting out an explosive breath, the young man gives everyone a nod of his own goodbye before turning to depart. However, just before he can go, a weathered, ancient voice echoes out through the area. You will not visit us again anytime soon, young stone. This will be the last time we see you for quite a while. Blinking, Axel turns back as everyone else looks to the speaker. Dolf, father of Shaga, one of the oldest living mountain men, sits there in a makeshift chair of sticks and furs, his eyes clouded over with blindness while his gray beard and hair make it clear that he's lived far, far longer than most. Shaga grunts and furrows his brow at his father. What does that mean, old man? What are ya seeing this time? Dolf's blindness came with a gift, though Axel had never been sure he believed in it. According to the Stone Crows, the former chieftain received visions of the future from time to time. Ridiculous, of course. But the young stone goes to meet with the Vale Lord, and the Vale Lord comes to take him away from the mountains of the moon. There's a lot of conflicted looks shot in Axel's direction at that. Many of them hate him for being stronger, faster, and tougher than them. Just as many love him for the exact same thing. Axel, meanwhile, is just plain confused. Lord Aron was coming to take him away. Why? He was nobody. Just a lowly bastard. Sure, he'd long since figured out that he might be the bastard of someone important, given that he'd been raised in a proper castle by the High Steward himself and the fact that he'd been given the last name Stone, whereas bastards born to small folk were given no such recognition. But that was that and this was this. Hey, from time to time, Axel had even privately pondered the notion that he might be Lord Aron's bastard. The man had been kind to him each time he'd visited throughout Axel's life, and he'd thought it might be nice if secretly they shared a blood connection. But he'd never asked. Not just because he didn't want to cause problems, but also because, by not knowing for sure, he could continue to pretend it was true. Still, as far as he knew, Lord Aron's visit shouldn't have much of anything to do with him. News of the king's death had reached Axel's ears, and that sounded awfully tragic, but he was just a bastard. A nobody. Snorting in amusement, Axel shakes his head at old Dolf. You're going senile, old man. But on the off chance Lord Aron does need me for something, just know that I can always come back and kick some sense into your thick skulls if I hear any of you have taken up raiding again. He sweeps his gaze across the gathered clans and is gratified to see big, strong mountain warriors all avert their eyes one after the other. Smirking, Axel just nods and turns to leave again, this time not looking back as he leaps and grabs a rocky outcropping that's about 20 feet above his head. Then he leaps again, and another leap takes him over the ridge and out of their sight. This was why Axel was so much better at dealing with the mountain clans than the Knights of the Vale. He could traverse the mountains of the moon faster than any knight or clansman who had ever lived. Leaping from rock to rock, jumping from ridge to ridge, bounding from cliff to cliff, Axel begins to make his way back to the eyrie, taking a route that only he can take. He puts the old man's words out of his mind as he goes. Sure, Lord Aron would probably have asked to see him while he was visiting, hence the High Steward using the horn, but taking him from the Vale. That was utterly ridiculous. One of the things High Steward Royce and Lord Aron had drilled into Axel's head from an early age was that he would likely never be allowed to leave the Vale. As they'd explained it, it was far better for all involved if he remained right here in the mountains of the moon, safe and sound. And Axel didn't mind that one bit. The Vale was his home, after all, and there was still plenty of things for him to do here. Why would he ever leave? Yeah, Axel, why would you ever leave? Chapter 4, Revelations. John gets to meet our man once more as he comes in from his ranging. Having learned that Axel was out on a ranging somewhere in the mountains of the moon, John expected to wait at least a day or so before the lad finally returned. He's therefore quite surprised when word of Axel's arrival reaches him and Lord Royce in his solar just an hour after the High Steward blew that horn. He's back already. He must not have gone very far. But Nestor just shakes his head as he sends the servant to bring Axel directly to them. I wouldn't count on that, Lord Aron. I've had men try to follow him before, mostly just to try and keep him safe and out of trouble. Not even my best knights have been able to keep track of him or see exactly where he goes or how far he ranges. John's brow furrows incredulously, causing his steward to grin sheepishly in response. You'll recall how fast he was as a boy, I'm sure. He's even faster now, Lord Aron. Faster, and far more cunning. Whatever he might have said in response to that never gets a chance to leave his lips, because the next thing John knows, the door to the solar is opening once more to admit the very man they're speaking of. And a man he is. It's not until Jon lays eyes on Axel for the first time in several years that he truly realizes he's been away from the Eyrie for far, far too long. It hits him then, as he finds himself staring, that Robert's son is no boy anymore, not even a lad, really. He's over 20 years old at this point, and he looks it too. Standing as tall as his father did at that age, with broad shoulders and a broad chest that out his Baratheon blood like nothing else, Axel has a full head of Baratheon black hair and stark Baratheon blue eyes. Truly, the only thing missing to make him a perfect copy of Robert from back in his 20s is the facial hair. By the time he was Axel's age, Robert already had a full beard. Axel, meanwhile, is completely clean-faced. That isn't to say he's baby-faced, however, because anyone who dared to try and call him that would have to willfully ignore the chiseled square shape of his jaw and the sheer presence he gives off just standing there in the doorway. Axel's eyes light up at seeing him and he quickly steps forward before dropping to a knee and bowing his head low. Lord Arryn, it is a pleasure to see you again. I only wish it were under better circumstances. Letting out a sigh, Jon stands up and beckons with his hands. Rise, Axel, please rise. And so do I, so do I. Slowly, the future king of the Seven Kingdoms stands up. He gives Nestor a respectful nod before once again giving Jon his full attention. For a long moment, Jon doesn't know what to say if he's being honest. Where do you even start with something like this? Come, sit with us, Axel. Axel blinks and hesitates for a moment before doing as he's told. Even as Jon retakes his seat and Axel joins them, the younger man's size is in no way diminished. He's big, very big. So much like his father back in the day. Of course, unlike Robert Baratheon, Axel has been raised as a stone, a bastard of the Vale. He's never known his true parentage, nor had any expectations of inheriting or becoming a lord one day like Robert did. As they all sit quietly for a moment, Jon finds himself realizing that this disparity has caused a key difference between Axel and Robert to develop. Robert would have already demanded to know what this was about. As he'd done in this very solar so many years ago when Jon had to tell him and Ned what the Mad King had done to Ned's father and brother. Axel, by comparison, is respectful and quiet to a fault, sitting oddly still and not fidgeting a bit, but also keeping his eyes down as someone of his standing should when in a room with men like Jon and Nestor. He seemed able to hold his tongue in a way Robert never could, but given he was about to become king, Jon wasn't sure if that was truly a good thing or not. Only time would tell. Axel, I'm sure by now you've heard the news and know why I'm here. The king and both of his trueborn sons are dead. A jolt runs through the mountain of a young man and his eyes widen as he chokes a little. Ah, apologies Lord Arryn. I'd heard about the king, but I didn't know about his sons. That's horrible. Jon shoots Nestor a look, but the other man just shrugs. After a moment, he thinks he understands it. Nestor wouldn't have personally delivered the news to the young man, that would have been too suspicious. Nor did the High Steward know that Axel was going to be the new king of Westeros before Jon arrived. And the news, no doubt it would take months for all of Westeros to learn that it wasn't just the king who had died, but also both of the princes as well. In the end, he couldn't rightly blame his second for Axel's lack of knowledge. Who's going to be king now then? It'll be Lord Stannis, won't it? A smile flits across Jon's face and he finds himself chuckling a little. That would be the order of things under normal circumstances. Well thought, Axel. Robert's son straightens up proudly at Jon's praise, beaming as though Jon had just given him the greatest compliment he'd ever received. However, there are extenuating circumstances at play. The smile drops and Axel's brow furrows in confusion. What do you mean, my lord? Jon can't quite hide his flinch at that. My lord was a small folk term of address. And it just passed through the lips of Robert's heir and the crown prince of the Seven Kingdoms. He truly had his work cut out for him. Axel, for the rest of this conversation, and possibly into the future, you can call me Jon, all right. Axel's eyes nearly bulge out of his skull at that, the younger man looking absolutely flummoxed by such an offer. Before he can respond, Jon holds up a hand and cuts him off. Getting back to before, what I mean is that Robert didn't die at the same time as his sons. He survived a few hours more. I was with him at his side in his final moments where he gave me his last edicts as king. He told me he wished to legitimize one of his bastards, and name him crown prince, making him heir to the Iron Throne. Jon watches Axel carefully for his reaction to these words. What he gets is, not quite what he's expecting. A small shudder runs through the giant of a young man and Axel looks confused, but with a hint of something in his eyes. Like he knows what's coming but finds it impossible to believe. I don't quite understand what this all has to do with me. Letting out an explosive breath, Jon leans forward, using the table in front of him as he looks Axel in the eye. Robert legitimized his firstborn bastard son. A young man who had to be set aside back at the end of the rebellion more than 20 years ago. A young man who was raised far from the king and his trueborn family all these years. Axel, did you never wonder who your father truly was? XXX. The blood pounds in Axel's ears as he sits there, absolutely still. Despite that, he hears everything that Lord Arryn says with stark clarity. And he understands it all with perfect clarity too, as much as he doesn't want to. He would love to play dumb. He would love to act like he didn't get it. Maybe if they thought him stupid, they wouldn't go through with it. But no. It's all so obvious now, isn't it? Almost petulantly, quietly, Axel finds himself muttering something he never thought he would admit under his breath. I suppose I'd hoped it was you. He flushes so hotly that the blood rushes down his neck immediately after he says that, while Lord Arryn sits back in his chair for a moment, clearly stunned. Then, after a long moment, the Lord of the Vale smiles sadly and shakes his head. If only, lad. If only. No, your father was Robert Baratheon, first of his name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm. And you, Axel Baratheon, are now his heir. You're the crown prince of the realm and heir to the Iron Throne, lad. Fuck. Old Dolph had been right, that fucker. Letting out a sigh, Lord Arryn continues on. You're right that without you in the picture, Stannis Baratheon would be next in line for the Iron Throne as the eldest brother to the king. However, Robert survived a little longer than his sons and was able to legitimize you with his last breaths. This was his dying breath, Axel, too. How did they die? He can hardly believe his own impudence. Interrupting a lord of the Seven Kingdoms. And yet, Axel finds himself with a burning need to know. The king dying before was, well, it was a tragedy, but a distant one for a bastard like Axel. And then learning that both princes had died as well, that too was disastrous, but in the same distant way. Not anymore. Robert Baratheon was his father and he was dead. His sons were Axel's half-brothers and they were dead. A family he hadn't even known he had, wiped out before he could ever even meet them. It hurt more than he would have expected, truth be told. Lord Arryn pauses and then quietly explains the grisly events that had taken place in King's Landing. It's both complex and simple at the same time. In the end, they died because an unknown cache of wildfire had been uncovered by the youngest prince and his father had been curious enough to see what he'd found. But the complexity lay in how far back that wildfire had been placed down there, having apparently been put there all the way back during the reign of the Mad King, only to never be used. When I left King's Landing to come retrieve you, a citywide effort to find and remove all of the remaining wildfire caches left behind by the Mad King's machinations was well underway. Hopefully, by the time we return to King's Landing, they'll have made good progress in dealing with the problem. Retrieve you. Return to King's Landing. Fuck. This was really happening, wasn't it? Lord Arryn had come all the way to the Eyrie for him. To take him back to King's Landing and crown him king. Axel's mouth opens and closes for a long moment as he's left uncertain of what to say. Finally, he says the obvious. He says what's on his mind. Surely it can't be me though, right? I mean, I'm not even properly trained for it. I've been nothing but a bastard my whole life. They can't possibly want me on the Iron Throne, can they? In this case, they, is, everyone. All the nobility. Especially the Lord Paramounts and their great noble houses. Axel can't imagine they'd be very accepting of him. He's not exactly king material, after all. But Lord Arryn just shakes his head. They will, Axel. They don't have any better options. Robert's final decree was clear and is his hand. It is my duty to carry out his last orders. But more than that, there is nobody else. Even if you were to turn down the throne, it would pass to Stannis, and nobody wants that. It would likely lead to war. Axel's eyes widen. What? War. But Stannis Baratheon would be the next in line at that point. He would be the rightful heir to the Iron Throne. How could it possibly lead to war? Seeing the look on his face, Lord Arryn offers a wan smile. Stannis is not well liked among the other lords of Westeros, Axel. He has a reputation for being cold and unfeeling to the point that even the nobility of the Seven Kingdoms finds him largely unlikable and therefore intolerable. To make matters worse, the younger Baratheon brother, Renly, is far more charismatic and personable. Lord Arryn shakes his head. Even in the short time before the king was recovered and I was able to hear his final words, I had courtiers trying to feel me out, seeing if I would side with Stannis or Renly for the throne. Lord Stannis was away from the city and still is, but Lord Renly is in King's Landing, fulfilling his duties as the Master of Laws on the King's small council. He himself did not approach me, but I would not be surprised if some of those courtiers came from him all the same. Leaning forward again, Lord Arryn looks Axel right in the eyes, sending a shiver down his spine. The Lord of the Vale's voice drops to a whisper, as if he's confiding some great secret to Axel. The Seven Kingdoms may be able to accept Stannis as their king, but not if Renly throws his name into the mix. If the younger brother stands against the elder, then the Seven Kingdoms will fracture and war will be inevitable. You aren't perfect by any means, Axel, but you're the best option we have all the same. You're a compromise that might just keep the realm from going to war. He appreciates Lord Arryn's honesty. More than a little floored by the sudden lesson in the cutthroat politics that apparently surround his uncles, Axel has to take a moment just to chew on all of it and then swallow thickly. Once he's done so though, he straightens up. It has to be me then. Will you stay on as my hand at least? Lord Arryn blinks in surprise before smiling warmly. Of course I will, my prince. I'm only getting older admittedly, but I have some good years left in me to help you find your footing if nothing else. With you as king and the peace kept, we'll have all the time in the world to make sure your reign is a successful one. Right. Axel lets out an explosive breath and nods. Then, I'll do it. I'll become king. I'll go to King's Landing with you. Those damn mountain clans better not make a mess of things while he's gone though. He won't hesitate to flat out run all the way back to the Vale if he hears that they're making trouble at any point. Wonderful. We'll throw a feast tonight and then depart in the morning, if that's all right with you, Prince Axel. King's Landing and indeed the whole of the Seven Kingdoms will be better off as soon as you are sat upon the Iron Throne. Axel blows out an explosive breath, part of him wanting to ask for a day more to get his affairs in order. But the only thing he would even do is go and find the mountain clans again, and really, he'd already said his goodbyes to them, technically. Nodding, he just grunts. That's fine by me. The High Steward rises from his seat then and heads off to make preparations for the feast, belatedly reminding Axel of his presence in the first place. Strange how a man who had seemed like such a large presence in Axel's life suddenly felt tiny in comparison to everything else. As Lord Arryn, as Jon begins to tell him more about what he can expect in King's Landing, Axel feels himself finding his resolve. If they really wanted him to be king, then king he would be. XXX. Yeah Axel, they all totally want you to be king. 100p. Anyways, next time we check in on a certain grieving mother over in King's Landing. Chapter 5. Cersei Lannister. Cersei is mad. B. XXX. Like hell was she going to let Robert Baratheon's bastard become king. Just the thought of it had Cersei Lannister seething as she stares off into nothing in particular. She'd shed all the tears she was going to shed at this point. So many tears that even now her eyes itched from how dry and reddened they were. In the initial days after the death of her sons, Cersei had been nearly catatonic from grief. If she hadn't been, she would have finished the deed herself the moment Robert was found under that rubble alive. She would have gone into his rooms, to his bedside, and strangled him right then and there. Alas, she'd been so out of it that it wasn't until after his final edicts and subsequent death that she'd finally come to her senses. Only hearing it from the hand of the king himself had gotten through to her. Robert had legitimized the bastard he thought he'd successfully hidden away from her in the Vale, and Jon Arryn was leaving to retrieve him and bring him back so they could crown him king of the Seven Kingdoms. Over her dead body. Cersei wasn't about to let something like that happen. Her hatred for Robert burned with the passion of 1,000 blazing suns at this point. He'd gotten her sons killed. Her beautiful boys, so handsome and fierce. They were true lions, the both of them. Not stags like Robert thought. Cersei loved her sons with all her heart and she wouldn't let their deaths go unavenged. Fortunately, an opportunity had been presented to her. One that Cersei would be a fool to pass up. Cersei. Blinking, Cersei pulls herself from her thoughts and looks over to her twin. Jaime Lannister stands there with his hand on the pommel of his sword, his handsome features twisted in agony. She understands, of course. After all, it wasn't just she who lost her sons. Were you even listening to me? Unfortunately, she didn't really have time for Jaime at the moment. Not if she was going to make everything work. They would find comfort in one another later, but right now, she needed to be able to focus. Still, she knows her twin is weaker than her. More emotional. Unable to see the bigger picture. He always has been. So she plasters an attentive look on her face. Apologies, Jaime. You were saying. His mournful look of despair only grows heavier as he begins to speak again. Cersei just tunes him out though, already back with her own thoughts even as she does a better job of pretending to listen this time around. Frankly, she'd been lucky she didn't lose Jaime that day as well. Or maybe not lucky so much as fortunate. More than half of the Kingsguard had been down there with Robert, Joffrey, and Tommen. It made sense, the three of them had represented not just the king and his male heirs, but also a majority of the royal family. But Jaime, Cersei could happily say, had been with her. Small mercies, that. It didn't make it hurt any less though. It didn't remove the gnawing, gaping hole in her chest where her heart had once been. Of her 3 children, only Myrcella still lived. Her beautiful, wonderful daughter Myrcella. Alas, Myrcella suffered from the same tragic affliction that Cersei did, she'd been born without a cock. If Myrcella were male, then Cersei probably wouldn't have even let Jon Arryn and his entourage get outside of the city. The moment the hand of the king came to tell her of Robert's last orders, she would have had him killed so that the fat bastard's words died with him. Then, her Myrcella could have ascended to the Iron Throne, a proper lion as king of the 7 kingdoms. Alas, the Lord Paramounts would not abide by a female ruler, not under any circumstances. That had been tested time and time again over the centuries. Not even a female Targaryen had been allowed to rule the 7 kingdoms. If not for Robert's final decrees, the crown would have gone to Stannis Baratheon by the laws of succession, and Renly Baratheon after him. Disgusting. Filthy stags, the both of them. She would see them dead too, of course. Stannis and Renly would both have to die for her plans to succeed. Which is why Cersei was actually glad for Robert's final words to Lord Arryn. By sending Arryn off to the Vale to retrieve his bastard, Robert unknowingly gave Cersei the time she needed to plan out her next steps. The bastard wouldn't make it to King's Landing, of course. He wouldn't even make it out of the Vale. Cersei had had such short notice to act, but she'd nevertheless managed to arrange things so that a loyal Lannister man had been inserted into Lord Arryn's retinue. The hand of the king would unknowingly deliver her justice to Robert's bastard for her. There was something so very poetic about that. Cersei, I'm trying to tell you, I knew. I knew all along and. Did you know I always knew about Robert's bastard in the Vale? Cersei cuts Jaime off, giving him a wolfish grin as he pauses and blinks at her in confusion. What? Cersei, you're still not listening to me. But Cersei just waves his concerns off. I was listening. This is just more important, Jaime. The bastard that Robert legitimized. The man who is supposed to become our new king. I've known about him for over a decade now. And oh how many times I've tried to kill him. That causes Jaime to freeze up, going pale. Cersei notices but just scoffs and rolls her eyes. He really always had been the weaker of them. If only she'd been born the man and he the woman, everything would have been better for both of them. I didn't start out needlessly cruel about it, you know. I just couldn't abide by his survival. The first poisons I had them sneak into his meals were gentle, meant to send him into a deep, deep slumber that he would never wake from. A kindness, I figured. Cersei. But they didn't work, Jaime. Every poison I had my agents try on the tyke, didn't work. Nightshade, powdered greecap, even basilisk and manticore venom. All procured at great cost from my own personal coffers. All failed. At first I thought I was being betrayed by my agents. So I sent multiple without the first knowing about the second. The first was to deliver the poison, the second was to make sure it happened. Cersei shakes her head ruefully. They reported no reaction. The poisons were definitely slipped into the bastard's food. They were ingested. But nothing happened. Even when I sent a third agent to mind the first 2, it was the same result. No matter what poison I concocted, the boy somehow survived it, growing all the stronger and taller and larger until he was no more a boy, but a full-grown man. Cersei, why? He was no threat to you. To us. Looking at her twin askance, Cersei lets out a bark of disbelieving laughter. No threat. Jaime, look around you. Look at the situation we find ourselves in now. Joffrey and Tommen are dead, along with that fat bastard of a king. Myrcella should be the next in line for the throne, but because of her gender, it will be given to Robert's bastard instead. This never would have happened if he'd had the decency to die years ago, damn it. Jaime shakes his head, staring at her with big, sorrowful eyes. That's not, Myrcella would still be behind Stannis and Renly for the throne, Cersei. Yes, that was true, wasn't it? Cersei just smirks though, pleased to be able to explain things to her twin, her other half. Even if Jaime was weaker, well, he still completed her in a way no one else could or ever world. They won't be a problem, soon enough. Neither will the bastard, you see. I've sent another assassin along with the Hand's retinue. He's been given a much rarer, far more lethal poison. Robert's bastard will never sit upon the Iron Throne. In Renly and Stannis, we'll deal with them next. Cersei. But Cersei waves a hand through the air, cutting Jaime off. Hush, Jaime. I need to think. Renly is in the city and should be vulnerable, but Stannis is all the way on Dragonstone. Removing him from the board will take a bit more effort. Cersei furrows her brow in thought, contemplating the issue for several long moments. Finally, she looks up to ask Jaime a question, only to blink in surprise at finding that he's gone, having left at some point. TCH. Sentimental fool. Joffrey and Tommen were dead and he was too busy getting weepy instead of getting revenge. It would have to fall on her, just like it always did. House Baratheon thought theirs was the fury. But they hadn't seen anything yet. XXX. She hadn't listened. Even the second time, when it looked like she was giving him her full attention, she hadn't heard a single word he said. Jaime knew this for a fact because if she had been listening, if she had heard what he'd been trying to tell her for days now, she wouldn't have just sat there plotting at him. If she'd actually listened to him, she wouldn't have even been able to look him in the eye. After all, it was all his fault. Jaime knew that Cersei blamed Robert for Joffrey and Tommen's deaths, but the truth was so much worse than that. Sure, maybe that damn oaf should have stuck to his drinking and whoring and everything would have been fine. Him deciding to take Joffrey and Tommen on an adventure, to see Tommen's discovery certainly hadn't helped to avoid the tragedy, that much was true. But really, it was Jaime who had gotten them all killed. 4 of his brothers in the Kingsguard, both of the princes, and yet another king. All dead by his hand. All dead, by his inaction. Jaime was the only man alive who had still known about the wildfire caches underneath King's Landing. All those years ago, when the Mad King had given Wisdom Rossart the order to set the caches alight and burn the city, Jaime had been forced to act. He'd killed Rossart and then he'd killed Aerys too for good measure. For that, he'd been given the mocking title of Kingslayer, a fancy way of saying he was an oathbreaker for killing the very king he was supposed to protect. Jaime had never told anyone the real reason that he killed Aerys that day. And he'd never told anyone about the wildfire either. If only he had. If only he'd warned someone, anyone. Then the princes would still live. Jaime couldn't care less about Robert fucking Baratheon. But if he'd done something, Joffrey and Tommen would still be alive. And that had been eating away at him like a hot knife carving up his insides every moment of every day since. His hope had been that Cersei would pass judgment on him. Out of everyone, she deserved the right, Jaime had figured. But she'd been catatonic at first. Grief-stricken and inconsolable. Getting through to her in the initial day or two after the explosion had been impossible even for him. And now, when she was finally back to herself and actually capable of holding a conversation, she still wouldn't listen to him. She still refused to hear him. No, instead Cersei was too busy plotting the death of more men. Robert's bastard. Stannis and Renly Baratheon. Jaime couldn't care less about those men, truth be told. But Cersei's plans for them brought his twin's vile personality into stark focus. It was like he'd achieved something akin to clarity regarding his sister for the first time in his entire life. Cersei Lannister was a monster. And Jaime wasn't sure he could abide by it, not anymore. Once he leaves the Queen's quarters, Jaime does not descend down through the Red Keep to the ground. Instead, his feet take him up even as his thoughts drag at him every step of the way. Until eventually, he reaches the top of the keep, stepping out onto the ramparts. The inside of the Red Keep is kept to a certain scent through the use of a variety of techniques, but once you step outside, the stench of King's Landing hits you like an almost physical force. Jaime rocks back on his heels for a moment but ultimately keeps going, striding forward with his eyes on the blue sky and the distant horizon in front of him. He'd thought about doing this the moment he learned how Joffrey and Tommen died. He'd contemplated the act the entire first night afterwards, while Cersei lay catatonic in her bed and he'd stood outside of her quarters, protecting her. Ultimately, Jaime had told himself he had to stay alive. For Cersei and Myrcella if nothing else. He'd told himself he wasn't fit to pass judgment anyways, that it had to be Cersei. She would be the one to decide his fate once he explained his culpability. But she refused to listen and now, all these days later, Jaime realized that his twin wasn't fit to pass judgment on him either. In the end, there was only one thing left to do. With a heavy sigh, Jaime takes off his white cloak. He's already tarnished it enough over the years. Folding it up, he sets it aside. Then, he begins to remove his armor. Better to have less between him and the impact to ensure what needed to happen actually happened. Finally, Jaime climbs up onto the parapet and looks down across the city. From here atop the Red Keep, he can actually see the efforts to dig up and remove the wildfire caches left behind by the Mad King. The entire city is abuzz with such activities. It's probably the most coin that has been spent on the people of Flea Bottom in years, turning them all into laborers and workers as part of the arduous process. This should have happened decades ago. This should have been one of the first things done after Robert Baratheon became king and Jon Arryn became Hand. It might have been if Jaime hadn't been such a tight-lipped fool. His silence had killed his brothers in the Kingsguard and his sons as well. Closing his eyes tightly, Jaime feels wetness on his cheeks and knows that tears fall across his face. He wishes he were stronger. For Myrcella's sake if nothing else. But, he couldn't. He just couldn't. I'm sorry, Myrcella. With those final words, the Kingslayer takes a step forward, and drops. XXX. A.N. Whelp. Chapter 6. The Feast. A.N. Jon Arryn is feeling really good about himself. Let's see how long that lasts. XXX. The feast celebrating Axel's legitimization and ascension to the position of Crown Prince is a paradoxically somber but also jubilant affair. It's not quite to the level of carousing and revelry that Robert had preferred, but there are more smiles on faces than Jon has seen in any other setting since the tragedy that took the lives of the king and his sons. Frankly, Jon feels like he's the happiest he's been since their deaths as well. Sure, it's not perfect by any means, but Axel has agreed to become king. That was the toughest hurdle and now they've passed it. There's a glimmer of hope in these otherwise tumultuous times. On the morrow, they'll leave for King's Landing and get Axel's butt on the Iron Throne as soon as possible. Robert's death, nor the death of his sons, would not soon be forgotten, but at least it wasn't the complete and utter disaster it could have been. Glancing over to his side, where Axel is sat next to him, Jon does a double take as he sees just how much food the young crown prince is putting away. Indeed, the future king of Westeros is currently consuming whatever's put in front of him and he's doing so at such a rapid speed that the servants are barely able to keep his plate occupied with each new dish before he's completely demolished the last one. Jon shakes his head in amusement and somewhat stupefied at the sight. Truly, Axel is his father's son. Back in his day, when Robert was closer to Axel's age, the far younger king could have handled the same amount of food, probably. On the other hand, that hadn't served him well once the rebellion was over and he needed to rule the peace that came after. Kings were kings and therefore allowed to do whatever they wanted to a certain extent, especially to themselves. Robert had drowned himself in wine and whores and ate enough food that he quickly went from the towering, imposing warrior of a man he'd been in his youth to the large, fat king he'd become in his later years. But it hadn't been Jon's place to tell him off for that. Or at least, that was what the Hand had always thought. Such thoughts had only been solidified by his first few attempts to do so back at the beginning of Robert's reign. The king had rebuffed him each and every time, and Jon had learned quickly to hold his tongue on such matters. Axel was different though, or so Jon hoped. The similarities between the young crown prince and how Robert had been at his age stopped at the physical. Mentally, Axel and young Robert couldn't be further apart, mostly because of the difference in their upbringings. So perhaps he would listen to Jon a bit better. Perhaps watching his weight and slowing down a little bit was the first of many pieces of advice that the Hand could give his new king and actually have it listened to. However, just before Jon can lean over to tell Axel he might want to slow down with the meat pie he's currently consuming, the heir apparent of the Iron Throne begins to choke. Jon's eyes widen a bit as Axel's hand goes to his throat, the younger man coughing and going a bit purple in the face. Alarm bells begin going off in Jon's head as others begin taking notice of Axel's distress. Axel. Axel, are you alright? Rising to his feet, Jon reaches for the younger man, only to pause when Axel suddenly recovers with a large gulp, the color in his face swiftly returning in what feel like some of the longest moments of Jon's already long life. The future king slams a fist into his chest a few times, and then laughs. Ha! Spicier than I'd thought it would be. There's some scattered laughter at that from those who had noticed the choking, but most are confused more than anything. Jon shares their confusion, though relief is the greatest thing he's feeling as he slumps back down in his chair. That incident might have just taken years off of his remaining lifespan. Still, it's a little strange. Spice wasn't something that was often used in dishes made in the Vale. The kinds of spices that Axel was talking about was more the domain of further south, mostly in Dorne with some creeping up into the Reach and the Stormlands. But the Vale tended to keep to the honest seasonings like salt and nothing else, usually. Things calm down, until Axel takes another bite of the meat pie. Then, he starts choking again. Jon is nearly as alarmed as last time, except the younger man recovers faster this go around, coughing some more and hitting his chest to make the food go down. Staring at the meat pie in question, Jon is just about to suggest that Axel should maybe move on to something else when the lad goes for yet another bite. It's after the third bout of choking that there's a sudden commotion down the length of the hall. Monster. He ain't human. It ain't right. Blinking in stupefaction, Jon watches as a man, one of his retinue from King's Landing in fact, comes rushing up the length of the hall, pointing a shaking accusatory finger at Axel. The Crown Prince pauses in his meal and stares nonplussed at the man in question, who looks like he's seen a ghost. "'Snot possible. You should be dead. I put enough o' the strangler in that pie to kill 100 men. You shouldn't be breathing." "What?" Jon rises to his feet again, words on his lips, but the captain of his guard is already moving. Ser Vardis Egan kicks off of the far wall and is halfway across the hall before the man in question is done speaking. By the time he draws a dagger from his belt and tries to lunge up the steps to the high table at Axel, the captain is there to grab him and disarm him, forcing him to his knees in a swift and efficient motion. Silence falls over the hall as everyone stops eating and stares at the unfolding situation. Jon, meanwhile, looks between the half-demolished pie and the kneeling man, his heart in his throat. "What did you say?" The strangler. Looking up at Jon almost plaintively, as though Jon would somehow vindicate him, the self-admitted poisoner whimpers. "Aaye, my lord, I poisoned the bastard with the strangler, I swears I did. He should be dead. They'll kill me if they find out it didn't work, but it's not my fault. He ain't human. He can't be human." There's a pause as everyone looks over to the future king at that accusation. Axel looks remarkably calm for having just found out he survived a poisoning attempt. In fact, his face is expressionless as he stares down at the kneeling man without a hint of pity. Finally, in the midst of the silence, Axel reaches down, grabs a handful of the meat pie, and puts it in his mouth. Slowly, in front of the entire hall, he chews and swallows. The reaction is still there, but it's greatly diminished at this point. He barely even chokes and his face goes pale for a brief second rather than fully purple. A grunt from Ser Vardis has Jon whipping back around just in time to see the poisoner has managed to break free of the captain's grasp and lunge up the steps in the middle of everyone's shock. He's not armed anymore though, and in the end, his target isn't Axel anyways. Thrusting his own hand into the center of the meat pie, the assassin stuffs it into his mouth and down his throat as fast as he can. His intentions become obvious a moment later as he immediately starts to choke far more violently than Axel did. "No." Sweeping around the high table, Jon curses as he reaches the man just in time for him to fall onto his back, his entire body convulsing from the poison coursing through him. The strangler, Jon has heard of it before. It was a rare poison, and an extremely deadly one to boot. It killed swiftly by doing exactly what its name implied, making anyone who consumed it unable to breathe. "Who paid you? Who hired you to try and assassinate the king?" Blood pours out of the assassin's nose as drool trickles from the corner of his mouth. He looks up at Jon, a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but it's already too late. He can't speak. He can't muster the strength to get the air from his lips. A few moments later, and he's gone. Ser Vardis stands at the top of the steps, looking pale himself as Jon straightens up and sighs. "Lord Arryn, I'm sorry, I should have had a better grip on the knave. I can only offer my sincerest apologies for my failure." But Jon just shakes his head. He knows why the captain of his guard let the other man escape. He was stunned by Axel's continued consumption of poison, just like everyone else. And now that it was confirmed that the meat pie was indeed poisoned, Jon had to run damage control. For a long moment, he doesn't know what to do or say, and then it hits him. "The 7 who are one watch over our new king." People jolt and shift in their seats as his voice carries through the hall. Gesturing from the assassin's corpse and then to a wide-eyed Axel, Jon doesn't bother with anything less than laying it on as thick as humanly possible. A miracle. The father and mother have blessed Axel Baratheon. They would not let him be taken on this day. They would not let the stranger have him. Praise be. There's a brief pause and then Ser Vardis, perhaps in the hopes of making up for the blemish on his otherwise sterling record, cries out at his side. "Praise be to the 7. Praise be to King Axel." The cry is taken up throughout the hall, everyone joining in now. Even the clergy in the hall, the Ares' own septon and septa, are forced to join in. Though Jon can feel the septon's eyes practically burrowing into the side of his head. The faith did not mind being co-opted by the nobility from time to time, and in general they were more than happy to lay claim to anything that could potentially be construed as a miracle by the seven. However, on a more personal level, the men who lay claim to the title of septons within the church did not appreciate being co-opted without being consulted first. And yet, the Ares septon was not about to stand up and deny Lord Paramount's words. All he could do was sit back and let it happen. Which was good, because this wasn't something they could let fester. Not before Axel had even sat upon the Iron Throne. XXX. Why did you tell them all that I was blessed by the seven? Jon sighs, resisting the urge to rub the bridge of his nose. It's an hour later, the feast done and him and Axel back in his solar for a little talk. The young man had the good sense not to try and say anything at the feast itself, but now that they were alone together, he had questions. Rather than answer him directly, Jon asks a question of his own. Why did you think that the meat pie was merely spicy the first time the poison tried to strangle you to death? You've lived in the Vale all your life, Axel. You of all people should know we don't spice our foods very much here. The young man furrows his brow at that, tilting his head to the side. Truly. But I've been given spicy foods from time to time for as long as I could remember. Jon goes still, silence falling for a long moment as he parses that statement. How so? Axel just shrugs. Sometimes my food has not been agreeable, though it's never been rancid or anything like that. When I was younger, it wouldn't always stay down, and sometimes, it went through me too fast if you know what I mean. A shudder runs down Jon's spine because he knows exactly what he means. And if Axel is telling the truth, and for what reason would he lie about this? Then that meant. Axel, I have reason to believe that someone has been trying to poison you all your life. The younger man blinks at that, looking baffled. What? But why would they? Until today I was just some bastard. A stone of the Vale among dozens. Yes. Yes he was. To most of Westeros, pretty much everyone, Axel Stone was nobody special. However, there was the possibility that in recent years as he got older, Axel's familiar appearance had been noticed and those who realized whose son he might be had spread the information. But that wouldn't explain the poisoning attempts when he was just a tyke. No, that spoke of greater knowledge, and greater hatred as well. Jon finds himself thinking of only a handful of people who might have had the resources to learn of Robert's bastard firstborn long ago, and the resources to try to do away with him as well. Many of them share the same house name, and one of them stands out among the others as particularly petty and vindictive. But he could also be wrong, and given the circumstances, the Lord of the Vale doesn't necessarily want to whisper potentially misplaced venom into Axel's ears before they even make it to King's Landing. For the time being, Jon swallows his suspicions and moves the conversation along, giving Axel a somewhat dry look as he sighs. You must have a particularly powerful constitution, Axel. To be able to handle the strangler like that, but did you truly have to keep eating the damn pie after everything? Axel has the grace to look a little sheepish even as he shrugs. It was pretty tasty, poison notwithstanding. Finally, Jon gives into the urge to cover his face with his hand, rubbing his palm against his forehead. It would seem that Axel was planning on being just as much of a headache as Robert had been, albeit in new and exciting ways. Still, one thing was absolutely certain. At least one person with powerful connections and deep pockets wanted the new king dead. Getting Axel to King's Landing and the safety of the Red Keep as fast as possible had become all the more important now. Once Axel was sat upon the Iron Throne and acknowledged as ruler of the Seven Kingdoms, everything would be fine. They wouldn't dare try anything after he was coronated by the High Septon and officially crowned king. Until then, they would just have to be doubly careful from here on out. No matter what, Axel could not be allowed to die. XXX. Still think you got over the biggest hurdle to crowning Axel as king, Jon. Chapter 7. Littlefinger. Back to King's Landing for yet another person who wants Axel dead. XXX. The dim, candlelit chamber is filled with soft, feminine moans of pleasure. The air is thick with the scent of incense and the musky aroma of arousal. In the center of the room sits a large bed, illuminated by the flickering light of numerous candles. There, two women lay entwined in a passionate embrace, their naked bodies glistening with recently applied oils as they move their hands up and down one another's curves. One of them is a petite brunette with porcelain skin, a northerner and a rarity this far south. The other is a raven-haired beauty with dusky skin marking her as Dornish, sporting a figure that would make any man weep with desire. The first is all over the second, and it wouldn't be surprising for an unpracticed eye to appraise the situation and assume the brunette was in charge. This couldn't be further from the truth, however. In fact, the northern woman is the student here, and the Dornish woman is the one gently but firmly providing guidance to her junior. Across the room, sitting in shadows with a wine glass in hand, is Lord Petter Baelish, master of coin and well-known whoremonger. Truth be told, for as many brothels as he owned these days, Petter couldn't be there for every audition at every whorehouse spread across the city. But he made time when and where he could to ensure quality control and the coin continued to flow. And in this particular case, it amused him greatly to do so. The northerner, a woman named Lyra, reminded him vaguely of the long-departed Lyanna Stark. The similarities were admittedly quite distant, but there was a certain pleasure in watching any woman from the north debase themselves for his entertainment given his history with the region's men. Rotating his wrist to swish the wine in his goblet to and fro, Petter brings the rim to his lips and takes a small sip, even as he continues to watch Lyra's education in using that supple body of hers for the delicate arts of debauchery and depravity. At the same time, the master of coin is multitasking as well, contemplating the recent plans he's set in motion. Life was made up of opportunities. Even when Petter was younger, he'd understood this well enough. From an early age, he'd believed nothing mattered except for finding your next opportunity and seizing it with both hands. Born to House Baelish, in such a minor holding that it had neither a name nor a maester, Petter had spent his early years in a small tower on the rocks of one of the fingers, bereft of such opportunities. Until finally, he was given a chance. Petter owed much to his father for the opportunity to eventually leave that place. To be fostered at Riverrun under the auspices of Lord Hoster Tully was not something that most lesser houses could ever hope for. It had been a great honor, but more than that, it had been a greater opportunity, one that Petter had tried his best to grasp onto and not let slip away. However, back then he'd only really understood the true nature of the world on a surface level. The younger Petter Baelish had grasped that life was simply a collection of opportunities, but he hadn't yet comprehended that there were many more layers to it than just that. Opportunities were not just about the benefits one could gain from them. They were not a singularly positive thing every time they cropped up. Sometimes opportunities came with costs. Sometimes, they came with consequences. A young Petter Baelish had learned this the hard way when he'd tried to win an equally young Catelyn Tully's hand. It had seemed like a golden opportunity to him at the time. Here he was, a young man who had grown up alongside the Tully children. Sure, the Lord's heir, Edmure Tully had saddled him with the rather insulting nickname of Littlefinger, one that had stuck all the way to present day. But in stark contrast, Petter had bonded quite closely with Lord Hoster's daughters, Catelyn and Lisa Tully. So closely in fact, that he'd truly believed he'd fallen in love with Catelyn, even though she never once returned his affections. In the end, Petter had convinced himself that all he had to do to win Catelyn's heart and hand, was defeat her betrothed in a duel. An opportunity to both have the love of his life and raise his station farther than ever before. How could he resist? Brandon Stark taught Petter a valuable lesson that day about opportunities and costs. He'd thought he could win through simple pluck and courage, but the wild wolf had defeated him easily and only spared his life after Catelyn begged her betrothed not to finish Petter off. After that, Petter had been cast out of Riverrun for daring to try to rise above his station. He'd been sent back to that nameless tower in the Fingers in disgrace, where his father had fortunately already passed away by that point of time. Petter had been left as nothing more than a minor lord of the most minor holding in all the Vale. A lesser man would have let that be the end for him. A lesser man would have withered away in that tower and let himself die forgotten and alone. But Petter Baelish was different. He had taken the lesson he'd received that day to heart. He'd been far more careful going forward, looking at every opportunity that came his way with far more caution. But he hadn't given in. He hadn't given up. In the end, all he really had to do was wait. Brandon Stark and his father died at the Mad King's hand, sparking a rebellion that ended with the Targaryens deposed after nearly 300 years and a new Baratheon dynasty on the Iron Throne. Catelyn had wound up marrying Brandon's younger brother Eddard Stark, but more importantly for Petter's purposes, Lisa Tully had been wed to Jon Arryn, Lord of the Vale. Lisa had always carried a torch for Petter, something he'd pretended not to notice in the same way he imagined Catelyn pretended not to notice him. But now that Catelyn was out of reach and Petter was without any other options, Lisa Arryn became his route back into power. Through her, he connected with her husband John Arryn and made himself indispensable to the Lord Paramount. First in Goldtown, where he managed to increase the port's revenues by tenfold, and then on to King's Landing, where the hand of the king had made him master of coin. What an absolute fool. Arryn thought Petter loyal simply because he was smart and useful and owed him for his benevolence. Little did he know that all the while, his hand-picked master of coin was cucking him behind his back. Lisa might have taken John Arryn's name, but she far more regularly took Petter's prick. Admittedly, Petter held no great attraction towards the lesser of the Tully sisters. Lisa was adequate for his sexual needs. However, she was instrumental to his long-term plans. Her use to him came not from carnal pleasure, but from the way she whispered his words into her husband's ear, allowing Petter to get away with all sorts of things right under the unsuspecting hand's nose. He might have managed the port at Goldtown perfectly with a spotless record, but Petter had been far less judicious when it came to his time as master of coin. Everyone underestimated him simply because he was a nobody in their eyes. He was from no great house, nor any particularly old noble lineage. He could not trace his lineage to the blood of any kings or queens. But Petter had long since realized that true power didn't lie in one's blood or birthright. True power lay in one's wealth. For someone like him, the only way to rise was to accrue money, and as master of coin, that was quite a simple undertaking. Especially with a king like Robert Baratheon spending so frivolously on his many sources of entertainment and distraction. Truly, Robert Baratheon had been Petter Baelish's greatest accomplice in all these years that he'd held the post of master of coin. Embezzling the amount of money he had from the crown would have been impossible under a calmer and more level-headed monarch. Especially with a man like John Arryn as their hand. But with Robert spending and spending and spending, Lord Arryn had his hands full. Between trying to prevent the king from bankrupting them and juggling the numerous creditors that wished to have their loans repaid, Arryn was stretched too thin. Whenever Petter could work his financial magic and alleviate some of the workload from Lord Arryn, the older man was grateful instead of suspicious, all because Robert's antics didn't give him the time to be suspicious. Really, it was a shame that the king had died the way he did. It was just so sudden. Even now, it felt almost like a dream. But then, even he, with his expansive network of informants using the whorehouses of the city, had no clue that they were all sitting atop that many caches of wildfire all this time. To know that all it would have taken is one incident to set the city aflame and kill them all, well, it gave Petter a healthy appreciation for the chaotic nature of the world, certainly. That said, Robert dying was one thing. His sons dying with him, that was something else entirely. All of the sudden, Stannis Baratheon was seemingly next in line for the throne for a moment there, and that was something that nobody wanted, least of all Petter. Fortunately, he'd known that Renly, the younger brother, would never let Stannis be crowned without some sort of a fight. However, before any plans to stimulate the coming war between brothers could be put into place, the hand of the king had brought everything to a standstill with his announcement. Robert Baratheon had survived the initial explosion only to die a little while later, but before he did, he'd legitimized his bastard in the Vale with his dying breath and made him heir to the Iron Throne. Petter believed it, to be fair. Some people had all the fucking luck, and Robert Baratheon had most definitely been one of them. Likewise, while everyone's lives were built on opportunities, there were some who received opportunities of a far higher quality than others. Again, Robert Baratheon was one of those men, despite how much he'd wound up squandering those same opportunities throughout his life. Not to mention, as foolish as Lord Arryn was for trusting Petter, he was an honorable, honest man all the same. If he said the king's last words were to legitimize his bastard and crown him, then that was almost certainly what had happened. Alas, it didn't quite line up well with Petter's plans. That's why he'd taken the opportunity presented to him and hired a group of bandits to make sure that Lord Arryn and young Axel Stone never made it out of the Vale. It truly wasn't anything personal, at least for him. Petter recognized full well how much he owed John Arryn, even if he felt no true loyalty over it. If there was a world where he could let the older man die of age in his sleep without ever finding out just how much Petter had used him, then he would have preferred it. But at the same time, Lisa has been begging him to kill her husband for years now, ever since she gave birth to that sickly brat of hers. After all, if John Arryn were to suffer an accident, then Lisa and Petter could rule the Vale together in all but name until the boy came of age. And if the boy never came of age, well, wouldn't that just be tragic? But Petter had been putting Lisa off all this time for some very obvious reasons. First and foremost among them was that he hadn't been entirely sure how the king would take the death of his hand. Even if it could be masked as an illness, Petter didn't know what Robert would do next. This opportunity, though, was simply too good. With the king dead, there would be nobody left to truly call for an investigation into the circumstances surrounding Lord Arryn's own tragic death at the hands of bandits. The fact that the king's bastard would die with him, well, that was just the icing on the cake, wasn't it? After all, if the hand of the king along with Robert's bastard never made it to King's Landing, it would give Renly Baratheon all the ammunition he needed to accuse Stannis of arranging the incident. If he didn't think of it himself, Petter would be sure to put the idea in the younger Baratheon's head sooner or later. And that accusation would be more than enough to spark a war between the two men, especially with the implied stain on Stannis' honor. No great council to decide who should be king, no peaceful transition of power. No, it was only in war that Petter could continue his climb up the ladder. Plus, Lisa would finally stop nagging him all the time, and that alone was almost worth the price of those bandits without everything else he stood to gain from this. Lord Baelish. Pulled from his thoughts, though he'd never allowed himself to be fully distracted, Petter Baelish returns the full focus of his attention to the whores on the bed in front of him. Lyra, he decides, has not disappointed. Rising from his chair, he walks over to the bed with wine glass in hand, watching in amusement as they both tense up on his approach. Taking his time letting his eyes drift up and down their naked, oiled, sweaty feminine forms, Petter hums for a moment as if in thought. Finally, he smiles thinly. Acceptable. Begin taking her with you for clients starting tomorrow. Do not let them know she is still in training unless they ask outright. Otherwise, simply advertise it as a 2-for-1 special. The more experienced of the two whores bows her head at that in easy acceptance. Meanwhile, the northerner blushes hard, her pale skin going bright red even in the dim candlelight. Petter chuckles at her reaction. You'll want to work on learning to control that blush, my dear. It betrays your inexperience. Some men will enjoy that, while some will not. In the end, you will make more coin if you can cater to both. Why yes, Lord Baelish. Left unsaid is that she would also make him more coin if she learned to cater to both. But Petter simply turns and leaves the room. He spends a brief time speaking with the brothel madam, before eventually heading outside where his carriage awaits to take him back to his quarters in the Red Keep. Truthfully, he didn't have all of his eggs in one basket, of course. There was every chance that his bandits would fail to kill Lord Arryn, or the king's bastard, or even both. Petter would have preferred to hire the mountain clans to do the deed, knowing they would have gone above and beyond to kill the Lord of the Vale, but alas, there simply hadn't been enough time to contact them and arrange the attack. He would hope that the bandits he did manage to hire wouldn't fail him, but even if they did, nobody would be able to trace their actions back to Baelish. Every opportunity came with as many costs and consequences as it came with boons and benefits. Part of playing the game was learning how to lessen those costs while magnifying the benefits. And Petter Baelish was nothing if not a master at playing the game by this point. XXX. Littlefinger scheming away, having no idea what he or the rest of Westeros are now dealing with. Chapter 8. The High Road. Axel is finally leaving home for the first time, how quaint. XXX. He's spent his whole life in the Vale. The Eyrie had been his home for as long as he could remember, and he'd enjoyed exploring the mountains of the moon as he'd gotten older and more adventurous. Truth be told, he'd never really thought he would leave the Vale behind. After all, he'd been told from an early age that he wasn't allowed to. Yet here Axel was, riding on horseback alongside Lord Arryn as the bloody gate steadily vanished in the distance behind them. He'd never been on this part of the high road before. In fact, in the far-off distance, he thinks he can already maybe make out the town of Derry, which will be their next stop as they go from the high road to the King's Road on their way to King's Landing. Truth be told, Axel still doesn't know how to feel about becoming king. But he knows even less how to feel about the attempted poisoning. If Lord Arryn was correct, it wasn't just this one time either. Supposedly, someone, or maybe even multiple someones, had been trying to poison him all his life. But why? Was it because they knew who his father was? That was really the only thing that made sense to Axel. Someone who knew he was the king's bastard wanted him dead. Alas, their greatest efforts hadn't succeeded. But he doubted that would stop them. Still, even the strangler had been a passing struggle at best. Sure, he'd choked a little bit and damn did it make his nostrils burn like nothing else, but ultimately it wasn't anything too difficult to stomach. For him, anyways. Maybe Lord Arryn was right. Maybe he shouldn't have kept eating the meat pie like he did, especially after the assassin had literally killed himself on the poisoned food in front of everyone. He didn't want people to think he was a witch or a freak or a monster after all. He definitely didn't want them thinking he was a demon. Especially since, Axel himself didn't quite know what he was. He just knew he was different. Always had been. Though, it had definitely gotten more obvious in recent years. He was strong enough to fight off 10 mountain men without breaking a sweat, and apparently hardy enough to handle a poison that could kill a regular man in less than a minute. Hell, if he weren't concerned about how people would react, he could have probably gotten off this damn horse and ran the rest of the way to King's Landing in a fraction of the time this journey was going to take otherwise. Axel didn't know why he was special. Maybe Lord Arryn was right and it was the Seven. Maybe they'd blessed him and he just hadn't ever realized it. If that was the case, Axel probably needed to visit the Sept more once he was in King's Landing. Though there it would actually be the Great Sept of Baelor, wouldn't it? Hey, that should be quite the sight, Axel figured. And as king of the Seven Kingdoms, they surely wouldn't begrudge him frequent visits, right? A copper star for your thoughts, Axel. Blinking, Axel looks over to Lord Arryn, who rides beside him as their group travels down the length of the high road, leaving the mountains of Moon behind. Processing the older man's words, Axel lets out a slightly derisive snort. Funny you should mention stars, Lord. I was just thinking about the Seven. Perhaps they did bless me, perhaps that's why I was able to survive the Strangler and the other poisons like it. Lord Arryn hums but Axel continues on before the Lord of the Vale can muster a response. I was just thinking that maybe once we're in King's Landing, I would make a point to visit the Great Sept of Baelor regularly. To say my prayers and show my devotion to the Seven. Slowly nodding, Lord Arryn chuckles in amusement. I imagine the most devout would like that very much, Axel. It has been quite some time since we had a king who focused on such things. Really? Axel brow furrows in curiosity at that. Was his father not very religious? Obviously the Mad King was the Mad King but. Thwip. Thwip. Just as Axel is about to ask Lord Arryn to clarify what he means by that, his head twitches and his hand lashes out. 2 arrows, fired from behind the nearby rocks on the side of the descending mountain road, try to find purchase in his and Lord Arryn's chests. He catches the one meant to pierce the hand of the king, while the second glances off of Axel and falls to the side. Even as Jon is still processing what just happened, Axel is already calling out. Ambush. The Vale Knights around them begin to react at the same time that their attackers do. All of them are moving, much too slow in Axel's frustrated opinion. Esser Vardis barely has his sword drawn as many of the men hiding behind the rocks come racing out armed with swords, spears, and other types of weapons. None of them are Mountain Clan at least, Axel is relieved to note. However, that doesn't change that they're coming right at him and Lord Arryn all the same. More than that, the archers behind the rocks haven't stopped yet either. Thwip. 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 More arrows lance out, this time aimed not for them, but for their horses. Cursing, Axel does the only thing he can think to as the arrows strike each of their horses in the chest and cause the massive beasts to rear back. As Lord Arryn becomes unseated, Axel leaps from his own saddle and tackles the older man off of his horse. Recognizing full well that a man of Jon Arryn's age should not be slamming into the ground at such forceful speeds, Axel twists himself and the Lord of the Vale midair, forcing his body under Jon so that when they both land on the ground a moment later, he absorbs most of the blow with the older man held to his chest like an infant. The air is barely knocked out of Axel's lungs as they hit the ground together, which is good because the next moment he sees Lord Arryn's horse falling towards them and has to once again twist around, putting the older man under him this time to protect Jon from the falling beast's weight. A grunt leaves Axel's lips as the dead horse lands on him, but truth be told, it's no worse than having 10 Mountain Clan warriors all try to pile on top of him to pin him down. The weight distribution is a bit more awkward but given they obviously can't just stay here and hope for the best, Axel quickly begins working them both out from under the horse. At the same time, the Lord of the Vale looks pale, his eyes wide as his mind catches up to everything that's just happened. Worrying for him, Axel frowns as he pulls them out from under the horse's body. Lord Arryn, are you alright? Are you hurt anywhere? Blinking rapidly and finally realizing the danger they're in, Lord Arryn thankfully comes back to his senses. Attack. We're under attack. Axel nods, even as he checks the other man for any obvious injuries. Thankfully he seems fine enough. His breathing is panicked but relatively steady and Axel sees no blood anywhere. Yes, Lord Arryn. We've been ambushed. By this point, they're out from under the horse and thankfully able to use it and Axel's horse, which had also collapsed after taking an arrow to the neck, as defensive positions. No more arrows come their way either, but Axel makes sure to keep Lord Arryn behind the horses anyways just in case. There were archers in the hills, Lord Arryn. You must stay here while I see if it is safe. As befuddled as he is, the older man doesn't react to that immediately. When he finally does, it's much too late. What? No, you mustn't. But Axel is already up on his feet and assessing the situation. Immediately he sees that Lord Arryn's entourage is still engaged with their attackers, though a glance around shows way more enemy bodies on the ground than there are Vale Knights. It makes sense really, because when Axel finally gets a good look at the sorry lot who have tried to ambush them, he quickly realizes they're little more than bandits. Earlier he'd noticed they weren't mountain clan at least, but now he recognizes from their poor armor and shoddy weaponry that they aren't much of anything, really. Those archers though, with a growl, Axel bounds across the battlefield as fast as he dares without being too unnatural. His sword leaves its sheath a moment later as he reaches the rocks where all of the previous arrows had come from. There, he finds two men with bows hastily notching fresh arrows, though when they see him they go for daggers at their waists instead. Axel doesn't let them make it to their blades, however. His sword flashes out faster than their eyes can follow now that he's out of sight of the rest of the fighting, and he relieves them of their heads, ending their attempts at assassinating him and Lord Arryn. By the time he returns from this, the battle is mostly over. The bandits have either fled or died to the Knights of the Vale. More than a dozen dead men lay on the cold unforgiving ground of the high road, and only one of them is a Vale Knight. The rest are their enemies. At Axel's approach, Lord Arryn rises from behind the horses they'd used for cover, looking quite cross with him. Axel, where in the world did you run off to? You should not have risked yourself for even a moment, your life is the most important one here. Wordlessly, Axel tosses the two bows he'd taken off of the archers to the ground, before nodding over to the rocks where he left their headless bodies. The owners of these bows are over behind those rocks. They were aiming for us specifically, so I knew we needed to take care of them before they got off a lucky shot. Lord Arryn's eyes fix on the bows for a moment as Axel's explanation washes over his ears. Slowly, the older man reaches up and rubs his chest, right where the arrow would have taken him if Axel hadn't caught it midair. Axel grimaces a little as the Lord of the Vale looks over at him with wide eyes. You saved my life. That arrow. He'd hoped that Lord Arryn wouldn't have noticed the arrow thing. It was definitely the strangest part of everything that just happened, Axel was aware. Before he can come up with an excuse of some sort, however, they're interrupted by Ser Vardis. Lord Arryn, Crown Prince, are you both alright? The bandits have been routed, but I wasn't sure whether it was a good idea to attempt to ride the ones fleeing down or not. His eyes lingering on Axel for a moment longer, Lord Arryn eventually shakes his head. Both of us are unharmed. Young Axel even took care of the archers who initiated the attack. Their bodies should be over there somewhere. As for riding down the ones fleeing, no, I think not. How many of the initial pack survived, would you say? Puffing up with pride, Ser Vardis grinned savagely. Less than a quarter, my lord. If that. Nodding at that information, Jon just grunts. Then they won't try again. Especially not without the archers. No, rather than split our forces in an attempt to chase them down, we will instead redouble our pace and make for the town of Derry with all remaining haste. Looking over at the men and the number of horses they have left, Ser Vardis considers things for half a moment before beginning to bark out orders. The death of one of the Vale Knights means that his horse is available for either Jon or Axel, but seeing as they want to make haste, doubling up is out of the question. To be fair, someone has to journey back to the Bloody Gate to tell them what happened here and send back a force to collect the bodies. It's just that under normal circumstances, you would want that particular person to do so on horseback. These are far from normal circumstances though, and so soon enough Ser Vardis has picked one unlucky Vale Knight to give up his horse and begin trekking back up the mountain road to the Bloody Gate on foot so that the rest of them can continue onwards without further delay. It's not ideal by any means, but as far as ambushes go, having only one casualty and being down only 2 knights in total, well, it wasn't bad. Meanwhile, Axel is just glad that they immediately take up a faster pace down the high road after getting everything situated, because it keeps Lord Arryn from questioning everything Axel had done during the fight for the time being. It's not that he wants to lie to the Lord of the Vale, nor does he want to keep secrets from the older man, but he doesn't really have any good answers to the questions Lord Arryn might wish to ask. In the end, all he can really do at this point is fall back on those earlier assertions about being blessed by the Seven. He was going to have to visit the Great Sept so many times once they finally made it to King's Landing. Axel just hoped that the rest of the journey would be far smoother. This was more than enough excitement for him, that was for sure. I'm sure now that they've dealt with Cersei and Petter's machinations, it'll all be smooth sailing from here. After all, there's no one else in King's Landing who might have their eyes set on the Iron Throne, right? Chapter 9. Renly Baratheon. Renly Baratheon has thoughts. As the last of their number finally arrives to the small council chambers, Renly can't quite help but needle him a little bit. Grandmaster Pycelle. How kind of you to finally join us. His dry tone and sharp smile cause the bumbling old fool of a Grandmaster to stiffen and stammer out some excuses, but Renly just waves a hand at him dismissively before looking around the rest of the table. He sits at the head of it, of course, as is his right as the current third in line for the throne. Of course, if the hand of the king were here, then Renly wouldn't dare take such liberties, but he's not here. Nor is there a king around either. Indeed, the small council has definitely seen better days, and its current state is indicative of the rest of King's Landing at the moment. For the moment at least, their number has been reduced to a mere 4, with the hand of the king away in the Vale, the master of ships off on Dragonstone, and the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard dead along with his king. Shame, that. If Renly could have chosen one man to survive the wildfire between Barristan Selmy and Robert Baratheon, Renly would have picked Esser Selmy every time despite Robert being his brother. Alas, he didn't get that choice, seeing as both men were now dead, and those at this table were left behind to pick up the pieces. Once Pycelle has finally taken his seat, Renly looks at the other two men who were already in attendance. Petter Baelish and Varys the Spider. TCH. At least Baelish was technically a lord, though nobody could even tell Renly what the other man was the lord of, save that it was some holding out on the fingers. Varys though, what a disturbing individual the foreign eunuch was. Why Robert had kept Varys around when he'd ascended the throne, Renly would never understand. He should have been replaced like all of the others. But Renly doesn't let such thoughts display on his face, instead affecting a warm smile as he looks at the Master of Coin and Master of Whispers respectively. As you well know, the Lord Hand asked us to continue meeting in his absence to make sure that things in King's Landing continued running smoothly. Most importantly of all, he wished for us to work together to make sure that the numerous caches of wildfire left behind by the Mad King were dug up and removed to the last before anyone else could suffer such a grisly fate as my brother and nephews. Here, Renly lets his smile become toothy, his eyes sweeping across them all but focusing on Varys. He might not go out of his way to express his inner dislike for the other man, but he was certainly willing to point out that this particular mess was at least partially Varys' fault. After all, what good was a Master of Whispers who didn't even know about such a massive threat to both the king and the city all these years? Varys claimed he truly hadn't been aware, but Renly didn't believe it for a second, not really. The other man was just too slippery by half. Letting his gaze on Varys linger for just a second, Renly claps his hands together, startling Pycelle quite badly as the aged Grandmaster jolts in his seat. Well, how go the efforts? Is the coin still flowing? Are the laborers content with their work? Are we using the most efficient methods of removal for such a volatile substance? Each of these questions, Renly directs to a different man at the table. Even if he intends to replace most of them once he becomes king, he's not about to let them get away with slacking off before then. As the first question was directed at him, Baelish also answers first, inclining his head agreeably. Payment has yet to be an issue. The royal treasury had just received a new loan from the Iron Bank. The influx of coin was intended for King Robert's name day tourney next month, but seeing as that will not be taking place, we've been able to divert funds towards the wildfire cleanup effort instead. Renly narrows his eyes at that. I hope you have not diverted all funds towards the cleanup. We will still have need of revelry after all of this. Especially with the coronation of my nephew coming up. Or rather, his own coronation, but Renly can't exactly say that out loud. Not yet anyways. Raising a single brow, Baelish smiles apologetically. Before his departure, Lord Arryn made it clear that the coronation was to be a minor affair. I've already set aside the coin for it, along with the festivities surrounding our new king's ascension to the Iron Throne. As per his instructions, I've kept things smaller than usual. That irritated Renly quite a bit. Where did Jon Arryn get off, exactly? Sure, he was the hand of the king and technically he had all the authority in the world to make such decisions, but it wouldn't be that way for much longer. Any day now, they would receive word of the tragic deaths of both Lord Arryn and Robert's bastard. And then it would be Renly who would be king. Not Stannis, the realm would never accept Stannis. No, they would pass him over for Renly, he'd make sure of it. Unfortunately, until that news arrived, Renly had to keep playing these foolish games. Smiling thinly, he simply gives Baelish a nod before turning his eyes towards Varys. The spider smiles at him blandly, giving none of his own inner thoughts away, just like always. There have been small pockets of panic here and there, but nothing too serious. Fortunately for our purposes, the vast majority of people here in King's Landing have nowhere else to go. While some have fled the city for fear of it blowing up under their feet, most seem to have joined hands in a rare active, community-focused effort and are working together under the watchful eyes of the Goldcloaks to continue the cleanup efforts. The Goldcloaks. An organization largely in the pockets of the Lannisters at this point. But no matter. Renly would reform them as well once he was king. At least Varys had no bad news for him. In truth, King's Landing was overpopulated anyways, so if a small portion of its population wanted to escape, he couldn't really bring himself to mind. Maybe it would help with the stench a little bit. Finally, Renly moves his eyes to Pycelle. The Grandmaster perks up. I've been, looking through my records, seeking out methods of handling wildfire safely. Alas, I haven't been able to find much. I would once again suggest that we pilfer the Alchemists' Guild for their secrets and force their members to tell us everything they know about their precious substance. What a fool. Pycelle was the epitome of a man without a lick of sense in his head who would spout whatever nonsense he could to try and sound smart. Even if fellow small council members both take issue with his suggestions. That seems inadvisable, given that the Alchemists' Guild have already agreed to work with us and so far have managed to keep another incident like the one that took the lives of the king and his sons. Indeed, their acolytes have been of great help on the ground as well from what my little birds tell me. Pycelle puffs up at Baelish and Varys' words, but before he can start an argument, Renly cuts in. Then it would seem that things are proceeding just fine even without the help of the Grandmaster. That leaves the old Grandmaster sputtering, but Renly just continues on unabated. While we certainly would have hoped that Citadel would be of more assistance in this trying time, I suppose we can only be happy with what we have, and wait for a more stable time to consider other options going forward. Pycelle looks aghast at that but doesn't try to raise a protest. Perhaps because he believes that he will be just fine in the long run, since Renly's position as head of the small council will not last much longer. Little does the old man know, Renly intends to be sitting at this table with a crown upon his head by this time next month. For now though, plastering a smile on his face that doesn't reach his eyes, the Lord of Storm's End rises to his feet and claps his hands together again. Well then, from the sound of things we're all doing our part until the hand returns with our new king. Hopefully we hear something about that in the coming days but for now, dismissed. None of them say a word as they all file out of the room. Frankly, Renly is confident that all three of the other men are just as happy to get away from him as he is from them. The difference is, he's going to be the next king of the Seven Kingdoms. And they're all about to be irrelevant. Making his way back to his quarters, Renly steps inside and lets out a sigh, his shoulders slumping as he takes a load off, so to speak. It was hard not saying what he truly thought, difficult to keep his feelings to himself. But fortunately it would only be a little while longer. And as it so happened, he'd had a lot of practice hiding his true nature. All his life, in fact. Renly. The first honest smile of the day spreads across Renly's face as he turns to meet his lover. Loras Tyrell steps up to him and they embrace, their foreheads touching as they enjoy a moment of solace in each other's arms. Eventually though, Renly has to pull away, eager to loosen his formal clothing so he can breathe a little easier. I just came from the small council, Loras. They are as barely competent as ever. The Knight of Flowers laughs at that, his eyes twinkling in amusement even as he watches Renly remove his shirt and roll his shoulders. That's high praise coming from you, especially for that sorry group of men. Grinning wickedly, Renly winks at his lover. I suppose when it comes to all of this dreadful wildfire, they're united in wanting the shit out from under our feet if nothing else. It's certainly not something I want still there when I finally start my reign. It was still insane to even think about it, truth be told. One day, everything is as it was, completely normal. The next moment, Renly hears the explosion and sees the green flames off in the distance. He's pretty sure everyone in the Red Keep could see it from anywhere in the castle. Only a little later had Renly learned what that explosion signified. Not just a blast of wildfire, which he'd vaguely recognized from that signature burning green, but a blast of wildfire that had killed Robert Baratheon and both of his sons. In an instant, the world had been turned on its head and Renly had been faced with the horrifying thought of his other brother Stannis becoming king on the Iron Throne. But that thought had very quickly been replaced by another, far more hardening thought: what if he became king instead? Stannis wasn't in the city, after all. He was back on Dragonstone, where the master of ships spent most of his time sulking because Robert had made Renly the Lord Paramount of the Stormlands instead of him. Even if Stannis had been in the city, Renly was far better liked by every Baratheon knight he'd ever met and certainly every Baratheon knight he had with him in King's Landing. With Robert, Joffrey, and Tommen all dead, as tragic as it was, Renly had quickly realized that he could be king of the Seven Kingdoms. He just needed to convince everyone that it should be him instead of Stannis, and given his brother's disposition, that should have been easy. But then, just as Renly was starting to make plans, they'd been dashed across the rocks by the announcement that Robert had survived the blast. Survived it, only to die a little while later. However, he hadn't died before legitimizing his bastard and naming him heir. Renly couldn't help but wonder what his eldest brother was thinking in those final moments. Probably that he didn't want Stannis to be king after he was gone any more than anyone else did. But had he spared Renly a single thought? Had he considered telling Jon Arryn to pass over Stannis and crown Renly king for even a single moment instead of his bastard? In the end, it didn't matter. Robert had done what he'd done and Renly was left to pick up the pieces, like always. For a brief moment he'd almost despaired, but then he'd found his resolve. Why should he let some bastard whelp of his brothers become king? Why shouldn't it still be him? Dressed down to just his breeches, Renly pours himself a glass of wine and sits down, taking a long drink before glancing over at Loras. Have you received word back from your father yet? Loras shakes his head, frowning slightly. Not yet. Though, I did as you asked and sent the letter by Rider using my most trusted man. It'll probably take a little longer than it would have by Raven. That was fair. The contents of that letter and Renly's offer to house Tyrell were, well, they were treasonous until they weren't, basically. So long as neither the Hand nor Robert's bastard made it back to King's Landing alive, then Renly's offer to Loras, father, was only slightly presumptuous. And it would be less so once he convinced the High Septon to back his bid for the Iron Throne. Stannis would either bend the knee seething, or be put down. Are you certain that the force you sent out will be enough, Renly? Blinking, Renly looks over at Loras, feeling a little insulted. Of course they'll be enough. Lord Arryn made no secret of how large his escort would be. I sent twice the number of knights to intercept him on his way back to King's Landing. Each and every one of them is a loyal Stormlander and they know what's at stake here. None want Robert's bastard on the Iron Throne more than they want me here. Funny how that worked. When it came to ranking the love that the Stormlands had for the three Baratheon brothers, the rest of the Seven Kingdoms might have foolishly put Robert ahead of Renly, after putting Stannis firmly in last place where he belonged, of course. The problem with that was, Robert had never really had the chance to rule the Stormlands. He'd been fostered in the Vale from an early age and grown into a man there. Then, the rebellion had kicked off and before you know it, Robert is successfully leading their armies to victory against the Mad King. Following that, he was swiftly crowned king of the Seven Kingdoms. Despite being the technical Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, Robert had never ruled in the Stormlands specifically. Not like Renly did. Renly had grown up in the Stormlands. He knew the lords of the Stormlands better than either of his brothers. He'd broken bread with those men more times than he could count and done everything in his power to lift them up to ever greater heights. The Stormlands knew what the rest of the Seven Kingdoms were about to find out. Renly Baratheon was the best damn ruler they could possibly hope for, and no one, not Jon Arryn and certainly not Robert's bastard, was going to get in his way. XXX. Poor Renly, his eyes are too big for his stomach. Chapter 10. The King's Road. Jon is on edge after the ambush on the high road, but hey, maybe they're finally going to catch a break. XXX. Thank the seven for loyal, stalwart knights. And thank them as well for Axel Baratheon. Even days later, having made it to the King's Road where they'd stayed the night in the town of Derry, Jon is still a bit tense. That bandit ambush on the high road had come out of nowhere and Jon knew, even if the young man was trying to downplay his part in things, that he would be dead right now if it wasn't for Axel. That arrow had been mere inches away from his chest when Axel had reached out and caught it right out of the air. More than that, the way he'd tackled Jon off of his horse as the second volley had flown was like nothing the Lord of the Vale had ever experienced before. Jon should have at least broken a bone or something, especially at his age. But instead Axel had somehow managed to cushion both the fall and the collapse of Jon's horse, taking what should have been Jon's injuries for himself. For a brief moment, Jon had been afraid that the young king had sacrificed his life for him, or at the very least his good health. But what would have been potentially fatal injuries for Jon seemed to be nothing of consequence for a younger man like Axel. He hadn't even seemed winded when all was said and done. Jon had tried to talk to Axel about the experience in the days since, but the younger man had been evasive to say the least. In the end, the most he'd been able to get out of Axel was more talk about being blessed by the Seven and a promise to visit the great sept of Baelor every day to pay his respects and give thanks if need be. Which, frankly, seemed like a very good idea at this point. Jon didn't think too many of the Vale Knights accompanying them had seen the things he'd seen with quite as much clarity as he had, thankfully. Even still, there was something very strange about the new king of Westeros, and it was likely only a matter of time before rumors started to abound, especially after what happened up in the Eyrie. They would need to get the High Septon and the rest of the faith on Axel's side sooner rather than later, lest they give his enemies, whoever they were, another way to undermine the young man's rule. And Jon knew for a fact that Axel had enemies at this point. The poisoning was one thing, but the bandit ambush. That was suspicious. Maybe if their attackers had been from the mountain clans, Jon could have simply written off as them being in the wrong place at the wrong time, but these bandits were decidedly not mountain clan warriors. Something Axel had agreed with when Jon had brought it up at one point. No, these were bandits from outside of the Vale who for some reason had traveled up the somewhat treacherous, exhausting high road. All to set up their ambush along a road that saw a bare fraction of the travel and wealth that passed along somewhere like the King's Road. Their presence on the high road just as Jon was coming down from the Eyrie with Axel at his side was no coincidence. Especially since there'd been no warning about bandits on the road at the Bloody Gate, and Jon himself had used that exact same road to get to the Eyrie in the first place mere days before. No, someone had tried to have him and the young crown prince killed, and if not for Axel's blessings, they might very well have succeeded. Needless to say, this all means that Jon is still very much ready for another attack to come even as they travel down the final stretch of road from Derry to King's Landing. They would probably stop one more time at either the Ivy Inn or Brindlewood before finishing the journey to King's Landing on the morrow, but in the meanwhile, they were currently on the largest stretch of the King's Road left between themselves and their destination. The perfect place for another bandit ambush to take place. They'd already passed by Harrenhal at this point, and if the trees weren't in the way they would likely be able to see the southern edge of the God's Eye to their right within the hour. But for as long as they were on the road invulnerable, Jon would be tense as a strung bow, waiting for the next boot to drop. Which admittedly is why he's so relieved when they see a group of knights on horseback crest the ridge up ahead and come down the road towards them at a canter. Why? Because he immediately recognizes the heraldry on their tabards. At his side, Axel stiffens up but Jon shoots him a reassuring smile. It's all right, Axel. They're on our side. Those are Baratheon knights. The young man blinks in surprise, though he doesn't quite lose his frown. Jon understands, the situation these past few days has likely been as rough for Axel as it's been for him. More so even, given the young man didn't even know he was the king's son until a few days ago. Still, it looks like they've finally had a turn of good luck. As the group of Baratheon knights slows down upon approach, Esser Vardis moves to greet them, taking point as the captain of Jon's guard to make sure they don't get too close to Jon himself. Ho there. Identify yourself, please. Coming to a stop, one of the knights moves a bit ahead of the rest of the pack and lifts his faceplate. Esser Emin Kai of Sunflower Hall. Ah, Jon recognizes him as one of Renly's men. It would seem Robert's youngest brother had sent them reinforcements, something that Esser Emin confirms a moment later. Lord Renly sent us ahead to intercept and escort you back to King's Landing. Smiling now, Jon lets out a sigh of relief. I suppose news of the attempted poisoning has reached the city by Raven at this point, though I don't imagine news of the bandit attack on High Road would have gotten there yet. Still, your assistance is much appreciated, Esser Kai. The Baratheon knight blinks in surprise before slowly nodding his head. Aye, that's right. Heard about the poisoning, we did. Didn't hear about a bandit attack though. Everyone all right. Sighing, Jon frowns as he thinks to their one casualty, a loyal man of House Arryn who hadn't deserved such a death. One loss, but beyond that we are all uninjured, hearty, and whole. Reaching over, he clasps Axel by one of his broad shoulders. This here is Axel Baratheon, Crown Prince and Robert's heir. He will be your new king. Something flashes across Emin Kai's face, but he nevertheless bows his head in Axel's direction with the rest of the Baratheon knights following suit. Your Majesty. Axel looks discomfited by the display, clearing his throat after a moment of awkward silence. Raise your heads, all of you. I'm not king quite yet. Chuckling, Jon shakes his head. No, but you are their crown prince already, Axel. Don't forget that. Robert's son frowns but slowly nods, accepting Jon's words. He really is a good man with a good head on his shoulders. Hopefully Jon would be able to help him become a good king as well. At least now that Renly's men are here, he's a lot more confident in their chances of getting to King's Landing without further incident. Looking back to Esser Emin, Jon's smile returns. As I said, your assistance is sorely appreciated, Esser Kai. Please, have your men fall in with us and let us pick up our pace towards King's Landing. With this many knights, not even the bravest of bandits will seek to strike at us, so we no longer need to move with any caution. As you command, Lord Hand. The Baratheon knights intermingle with the Knights of the Vale at that, though there are twice as many of the former, making it almost feel like an encirclement rather than a merging. Jon doesn't mind too much though. In fact, after how the last few days have gone and the 2 attempts on Axel's life, he finds himself warmed by the level of care Renly Baratheon is showing for his nephew. The Master of Laws would surely be a stalwart ally for Axel once they reach King's Landing and the young man has been coronated. Someone who Axel can lean on even as everyone else tries to manipulate and for Renly. Urk. Jon's eyes widen as he's cut off mid-thought by an unexpected battle cry. Esser Emin Kai's words are in turn repeated by every Baratheon knight as the sound of swords being unsheathed fills the air. Before any of the Knights of the Vale can react, Esser Emin has already stabbed his blade deep into Esser Vardis' gut, taking the older knight clean off of his horse and sending him to the ground. From there, pandemonium. And betrayal most foul. Treachery. Knights of the Vale, rally. To their credit, not all of Jon's knights fall to ambush. Some are able to block or dodge the blows sent their way, with some blows simply failing to land properly. The fact that they're all on horseback and we're all nearly at a standstill makes things every bit as awkward for their attackers as it is for them. But in the end, Jon can quickly tell that it probably won't matter. They're outnumbered and surrounded, and even those who survive the first blows don't all survive the second. And those who manage to survive the second still find themselves dealing with 2-on-1 odds at a minimum. Of course, then there's Esser Emin. As soon as he's dealt the death blow to Esser Vardis, Esser Emin turns and tries to swing his sword at Jon. Tries being the opportune word, because it never reaches the Lord of the Vale. Instead, it stops dead in its tracks when Axel grabs it by the blade barehanded and holds it still. Esser Emin's eyes widen in disbelief, even as his attempts to tug his weapon free are met with failure. In the momentary lull, Jon finds himself meeting the Baratheon knight's eyes. Why? Why would Renly do this? Gritting his teeth, Esser Emin growls as he struggles to free his blade and slice through Axel's fingers in the process. Lord Renly is the king that the 7 kingdoms need right now. Not the bastard of a king who lost himself in wine and whores for the last 20 years, nor the hand who let him do so. Jon lets out a low breath at the sheer vitriol and venom in Esser Emin's voice. He doesn't get a chance to respond though, because the tug-of-war between Axel and the Baratheon knight comes to an abrupt and sudden end. Not because Axel finally lets the other man have his sword back, but because he finally stops playing around, rips it out of Esser Emin's hand, and then swings its pommel across his face like a cudgel. CCRACK. The Baratheon knight goes flying from his horse as his head turns with a sickening snap, landing in a limp sack-like manner that long experience says he's already dead before he even hits the ground. Unfortunately, as satisfying as that is to see, it doesn't change the dureness of the greater situation. All around them, the battle is going bad fast. Seeing just how many of his knights are already on the ground, Jon reaches over and grabs Axel by the arm. You must flee, Axel. This is not a battle that can be won, but you of all people need to survive at any costs. Someone has to tell the lords of Westeros of Renly's base treachery. For a long moment, the younger man just stares at Jon blankly, and Jon fears that Axel might be in a state of shock. Sure, he'd killed those 2 bandits back on the high road, but no. The blankness drops away after a moment and Robert's son lets out a shuddering breath. Please do not think too poorly of me for what I am about to do, Lord Arryn. Jon opens his mouth, but Axel doesn't wait for a response. Winding back his arm, he throws Esser Emin Kai's sword from his hand, somehow having not cut himself even slightly on the castle-forged steel. Slicing through the air almost too fast for Jon's eyes to track, the sword slams into the back of a Baratheon knight harrying one of the few living knights still on their side and punches right through his armor and out the front of his breastplate, killing him on the spot. From there, Axel draws his own sword from its sheath and leaps from his saddle, forcing Jon to hastily take the reins of his horse so it doesn't go galloping off. What follows is a monstrous display of strength and speed. Renly's men, who had been mere moments away from carrying the battle with their superior numbers and the element of surprise on their side, now have the tables turned on them completely. Their numbers might still be superior, but that's the only thing they have going for them. Meanwhile, the element of surprise now rests with Axel Baratheon. In the confusion, it takes a minute for the enemy knights to realize they're being slaughtered by one single man. Some of them jump down from their horses to group up and face him on the ground, while others turn coward and break from the rest upon registering Esser Emmon's body and seeing what Axel is doing to their number. The latter group are the only ones to survive the ensuing massacre, causing Jon to press his lips together into a thin line as he watches a few of them ride back down the King's Road towards King's Landing at a full gallop. He wishes that he had the knights left to go after them, but at this point in time, aside from him and Axel, the remaining knights of the Vale number just 2. By the time Axel is through, however, the number of Baratheon knights left on the battlefield numbers even less than that. The young man falls upon them like the stranger itself, crashing into men in full armor and sending them tumbling every which way as his sword flashes out and takes life after life. When it's finally over, Jon can only stare, open-mouthed, along with his 2 living knights at the bloody scene. Axel, standing there with the blood of over a dozen knights covering him but none of his own, looks around for a long moment before looking to Jon with wide, trepidatious eyes. It seems strange to see fear in the eyes of a man capable of killing so many without even breathing heavy. But Jon thinks he understands. Axel doesn't fear death. He fears rejection. He's shown himself to be, beyond a normal man should be. A monster. And now he worries that Jon will turn on him. He may not understand what exactly Axel is, but there's one thing the Hand of the King knows for sure. If he had been anything less than this, they would all be dead right now. Slowly, Jon dismounts while calling for one of his still living men to collect the reins of the nearby steeds and make sure they will still have 4 able-bodied mounts to take them the rest of the way to King's Landing. Then, he walks through the bloody battlefield that this stretch of the King's Road has become, striding right up to Axel. Quote. Kneel, Axel. Blinking, Axel furrows his brow in confusion. Still, after a moment of awkward silence, he follows Jon's orders and kneels. Drawing his own sword from his side, Jon lets out a shuddering breath. He's an old man at this point. Not much of a fighter anymore. But he's lived a long life, and part of that life gives him the right to do this. Not just as Lord of the Area and Lord Paramount of the Vale, nor just as Hand of the King, but also as a Knight of the 7 Kingdoms. Even if, admittedly, it's been a long time since Jon last swung a blade. For showing extreme valor in a battle thought to be lost, for defending against renegade knights who have forsaken their vows, I knight you, Axel Baratheon. Bringing the sword up, he places it on Axel's right shoulder. In the name of the warrior, I charge you to be brave. Moving the sword to the left, he continues. In the name of the Father, I charge you to be just. Moving the sword to the right again, he finishes up. In the name of the Mother, I charge you to defend the innocent. Pulling his blade back, Jon smiles softly. Arise, Axel Baratheon, a knight of the 7 kingdoms. The words hang heavy in the air. It might seem pointless, given that Axel was bound for kinghood if they ever managed to make it to King's Landing, but sometimes pointless rituals were exactly what they needed. As Axel stands up to his full height, Jon can see the gratitude in the younger man's eyes and knows that he's done the right thing. Whatever Axel might be, he is first and foremost the next king of the 7 kingdoms. That's all that matters in the end. Everything else is secondary. Well now, Axel is a knight, that's lovely. But more than that, he had to reveal his true nature. Dun dun dun. Chapter 11. The Spider. The spider spins his web. Even after all these years, there was something so fascinating about watching everybody scurry about, playing their games and scheming to their heart's content. Each and every last one of them thinking themselves smarter than all the rest. All of them convinced that they and they alone could fool everyone else into dancing to their tune. Personally, Varys knew full well that he didn't know everything. That was half the reason he sought out as much knowledge as he could. His thirst for secrets, his hunger for information, it had served him well in the decades he'd spent in King's Landing. Quite well indeed. But things weren't always perfect. And Varys could acknowledge full well now that looking back, he'd made his fair share of mistakes. When King Aerys II had first brought Varys to Westeros, the much younger spymaster had still been a creature of avarice and ambition like so many others in the king's court. He had used copious amounts of the crown's coin to build his spy network on the continent, sending out his little birds in every direction to bring him scraps of information that he could take and use for his own purposes. In turn, Varys had served the king faithfully and loyally as his master of whisperers, believing that it was only the right thing to do when Aerys was so willing to fund Varys' endeavors. Only now with so much time and so much distance could he look back and acknowledge the mistakes he'd made. The Mad King was already mentally unwell even back then, but Varys hadn't cared. Newly arrived in King's Landing and drunk on his own skill, he had only really been interested in proving himself. No more, no less. Hey, if Varys the Younger could see him now, he dared not think what he might say. Varys the Elder, or rather, Varys of the present, was a far different man having seen what his folly and hubris brought the world. These days, he was far more discerning about just who he gave his true loyalty. Back in the days before the rebellion, Varys the Younger had turned Rhaegar's plans over to his father, counseling to Aerys that his own son was planning to overthrow him. If he could go back and do it all over again, he would have chosen differently. Rhaegar would have been a much better ruler than Aerys after all, and likely a better ruler than Robert Baratheon as well. But alas, what's done is done and crying over it was futile. In a similar manner, Varys also had to eat crow regarding the wildfire caches hidden all over the city. He hadn't known about them, but he should have. A humbling experience, to say the least. Still, to be humbled was to be human. And Varys couldn't help but feel that there were many more people in King's Landing that could do with a good humbling at this point in time. Everyone had their plans in the wake of the king's death. Everyone had their schemes. The Queen, for instance. Word of the attempted poisoning of the recently legitimized Axel Baratheon had reached Varys' ears by this point, his little birds up in the Vale sending the information along before it had even reached King's Landing. Varys didn't need to know anything more than that the attempt had been made to know who had tried to kill Axel Baratheon with the strangler, of course. After all, Cersei Lannister had been trying to kill young Axel since he was a babe. Her attempts to poison Robert's oldest bastard were well documented, at least as far as Varys' network was concerned. As were her failures. This latest effort had been a failure as well, though the stories left Varys more than a little curious to how it had been done. He'd received such fanciful tales, and his little birds were not known for their creativity nor their imagination. Likewise, there was Littlefinger. The minor lord of a minor holding who had managed to raise himself up to greater and greater heights through cuckolding the very patron who had brought him to King's Landing and made him master of coin. Varys doubted that Petyr even suspected he knew about his long-running affair with Lisa Arryn, otherwise the man would have almost certainly tried to have him killed by this point. Just as he'd tried to have Lord Arryn and Axel Baratheon killed on the high road just a few days ago. Bandits, such a messy tool to be sure. The whole thing smacked of general incompetence and opportunistic greed, both things that Varys had long come to associate with his so-called rival over the years. Of course, any rivalry between him and Lord Littlefinger was entirely in the other man's head. Varys didn't have rivals. To put it in a way that Petyr would understand, he had assets and he had liabilities, though the two could certainly be interchangeable. Varys didn't always protect his assets nor did he strike down his liabilities. At the end of the day, Baelish was useful enough to Varys in his own way that he would keep the other man's secrets for the time being. Besides, it would be amusing to see what Littlefinger would do next now that his initial opportunistic attack on the Hand and their new would-be king had failed. And then there was Renly Baratheon. Varys can't help but smile a little as he stands in the shadow of an entrance to the Red Keep's many hidden passages. Situated on the outside of the keep itself, this particular exit gives him an excellent view of the southern gate, even this late in the evening. Especially when he's able to track the Lord Paramount of the Stormlands and his men via their torches as they make their way through the street towards the gate. Earlier today, the knights that Renly had sent out to intercept Jon Arryn and Axel Baratheon had returned through the north gate and made a beeline for Lord Renly's chambers in the Red Keep. Or rather, what was left of them anyways. Out of the dozens of Baratheon knights that Renly had tasked with making sure the Lord Hand and their new king never actually made it to King's Landing, a mere 3 made it back alive. They'd immediately gone to inform their lord of their failure of course, and in response Renly had, for once since this whole mess began, made a smart decision. He was running. What else could he do? He didn't have control of the Gold Cloaks, they were mostly loyal to the Lannisters. He wasn't particularly well loved or respected by the faith, not with his sword swallowing something of an open secret among the nobility of Westeros. And above all else, he'd spent most of his actual military strength in the city on the failed attempt on his nephew's life. Put simply, Renly hadn't finally made the right decision because he'd somehow become smarter than he was yesterday. No, he'd made the right decision because it was the only decision he had left. What the Lord of Storm's End would do once he fled all the way back to his lands, Varys wasn't sure. He had plenty of little birds that would inform him of Renly's plans as soon as they could find them out though. One thing was certain, however, Varys did not think that Renly was the right fit to sit upon the Iron Throne. Varys the Younger might not have cared, but Varys the Elder cared a bit too much after all these years. In his old age, the Spider found himself caring about stability. About good, honest sense. About calm and rational leadership. Robert Baratheon might not have been the best king they could have had these past 20 or so years, but he was better than his predecessor, Varys had to give him that. At the same time, his sons had worried Varys. The eldest, Joffrey, had been incredibly cruel and downright monstrous, reminding Varys more of the man that Robert had successfully dethroned than anything else. Meanwhile, the younger one, Tommen, had been terribly shy, a consequence of being a target of his elder brother's sadism for so much of his life. Neither was what Varys considered a fitting king for the Seven Kingdoms, and that mattered a lot more to him these days. At some point in the last few decades he had come to care about this damn continent and the people on it. That the princes had died with their father, while a terrible tragedy, might also turn out to be a blessing in disguise. Stannis Baratheon might make for a good king. No, actually, by Varys' standards he would make an excellent king. The only real issue was that everyone else did not share Varys' standards. Stannis was so universally disliked by his peers that his own younger brother had immediately began plotting to take the Iron Throne after Robert's death. Renly would ultimately make for a mediocre king. Better than Robert but not as good as Stannis in Varys' humble, completely unbiased opinion. And yet, he couldn't help but get ahead of himself. If he truly wanted to be king, he should have tried calling for a great council openly. He should have questioned the veracity of Robert's final words coming on his deathbed when the man was half-burned to death, and demanded that the great houses of Westeros gather to have a say in who should be the king after Robert. If he really thought he had a chance, put himself before them all as the best possible option. But of course, Renly knew what Varys knew. His proclivities were enough of an open secret among the lords of Westeros that no great council would ever be likely to make him king. Maybe if it was just him and Stannis and nobody else, but that was where things got so messy, wasn't it? Because it wasn't just Robert's brothers anymore. It was also his hastily legitimized bastard son. A woman's scream suddenly splits the night air, causing Varys to glance up above him through the stone to where it comes from. The scream was not one of fear or sadness or horror, but rather, anger. Raw, furious rage. As such, Varys knows that Cersei Lannister has just found out that Renly fled the city. Sir Jaime's death had sent the Queen Dowager into another tailspin. At first, she'd screamed that it was murder, but all signs pointed to the man throwing himself off of the highest ramparts of the Red Keep. There were no signs of a struggle. Everything from his sword to his armor to his white tabard had been neatly set aside before he jumped. The death of one of the 3 remaining members of the Kingsguard had thrown the city into quite the tizzy. Varys himself suspected he knew why Jaime had done it, even if nobody else seemed to have put 2 and 2 together. From what Varys knew though, it seemed likely that they'd finally uncovered the real reason that Jaime Lannister killed the Mad King all those years ago. After all, it hadn't just been Aerys that Jaime killed that day. It had also been the latest hand of the king, Wisdom Rossart of the Alchemists Guild. Who could have commissioned so much wildfire from the guild? Who could have ordered it all buried beneath the city? And how in the world could the knowledge of its existence died such a quiet death that it took more than 20 years for it to be discovered? Everyone else tended to forget who the Mad King's last hand was. But not Varys. Varys didn't forget things. Jaime's death had been the last piece of the puzzle he needed to be absolutely certain of what must have happened. The Kingslayer had broken his oath to save the city from Aerys and Rossart's madness. And then he'd kept it a secret for more than 2 decades. In doing so, he'd gotten half of the royal family killed. He'd gotten his sister's sons killed. The guild must have eaten poor Jaime Lannister alive, because in the end, he'd taken his own life. Funny how fate works sometimes. Cersei had come out of another bout of catatonic shock over Jaime's suicide, still under the impression that her latest attempt at poisoning Axel Baratheon up in the Eyrie would have succeeded. When she'd then heard about Renly sending so many of his knights out of the city, she decided it was the perfect time to kill him and do away with one of the Baratheon brothers. Alas, Cersei's intelligence network wasn't nearly as good as Varys, nor had the widowed queen thought to consult the Master of Whispers. If she had, Varys isn't sure what he would have told her in all honesty. But it mattered not, because at the end of the day, Cersei Lannister thought herself a player and not a pawn. She'd been outmaneuvered by her target, though, completely by accident. Renly's flight from the city just so happened to allow him to dodge Cersei's would-be assassination attempt entirely. Judging by the moving torches heading for each of King's Landing's gates, the Queen has now given orders to have the city put in a state of lockdown. Nobody in or out. Perhaps she hopes to catch Renly hiding somewhere in King's Landing. Or perhaps she fears he discovered her plot, he hadn't, and now tries to cover up her actions and hide the attempt. In the end, it matters little, at least to Varys. The Queen believes Axel Baratheon to be dead. Littlefinger has yet to hear back from his assassins and perhaps believes much the same. Renly knows that Axel and Lord Arryn still live and are heading towards King's Landing, but he's fled before he could tell anyone. Only Varys knows everything to do with this truly sordid mess. Only he has all of the pieces of this particularly ghastly puzzle. And yet, he's told nobody anything. For one, none of them have asked. For two, none of them are his king. It's a delightfully messy situation they all find themselves in. And yet, Varys' humor is tempered a bit by the strange tales that have begun to surround their would-be king. Axel Baratheon is said to have survived the Strangler, a rare and extremely deadly poison, without breaking a sweat. Likewise, Varys has heard rumors that he saved Lord Arryn's life and did not take a single injury during the ambush by Littlefinger's bandits. And now there are the strange tales from Renly's surviving men, picked up by Varys, little birds, and dutifully written down exactly as they were spoken by those panicked, unmanned knights. Tales of Axel Baratheon moving faster than any man should be able to. Tales of him being a demon who killed half of them before they could even blink. Tall tales, no doubt, to hide their failure when they should have had twice as many men and the element of surprise to boot. But at the same time, Varys couldn't be sure. He knew better than most that magic was very real. He'd experienced the horrors of magic firsthand, in fact. He just wasn't sure where an orphan like Axel Baratheon would have come upon the chance to learn magic, sequestered as he'd been up in the Vale all his life. Even the stories Varys had heard about Axel making inroads with the mountain clans didn't explain it. Those brutish men who made the crevices and crags of the Mountains of the Moon their home did not have a reputation for profane rituals or dark magics. They were savages who relied on strength of arms and viciousness to carry out their raids on the more civilized people of the Vale, not blood sacrifices or anything like that. Still, there was an old saying that came to mind as Varys slipped back from the shadowed alcove and back inside, making his way back into the bowels of the Red Keep's hidden passage network. Once was happenstance, twice was coincidence. But three times, three tales regarding Axel Baratheon's strangeness now, that bore further investigation. Of all the current candidates for the throne, Axel Baratheon held the most esteem in Varys' eyes at the moment. Not because of anything the young man himself had done, but because he had the backing of Jon Arryn. And for all his numerous failures to rein in Robert, as well as his perpetual blindness to Littlefinger's machinations, Lord Arryn had proven to be a somewhat capable administrator. But if Axel Baratheon turned out to be a young, aspiring sorcerer, then Varys wasn't sure he would be able to accept that. Not even if it was for the good of the realm. Next time, Axel and Jon make it to King's Landing at long last. Just a couple more chapters and then we'll be done with the first arc of the story. Chapter 12. King's Landing. King's Landing at long last. Lord Arryn has them ride straight on through the night following the backstabbing and knighting. For Axel, this isn't a problem. But for Lord Arryn, the remaining two Vale Knights, and all of their horses, it's a bit of an issue as the harsh pace wears on them. In the end, they're forced to stop at Hayford Castle for new mounts, where Axel watches on tensely while Lord Arryn throws around his authority as Hand of the King. Axel is primed and ready for the men at Hayford Castle to betray them as well. If they force him to once again defend the Lord of the Vale with his inhuman strength, then that's what he'll do. But fortunately his uncle's treachery doesn't appear to extend this far. But then, if Lord Arryn is correct, it might not even extend to all of King's Landing. To hear the older man explain it, he doesn't actually believe Renly has the resources or the men to take control of the city. If he did, he would have already done so and simply had Axel and Jon thrown into prison cells or executed on the spot the moment they arrived. On top of that, with the death of so many Baratheon knights on the King's Road, Renly will be in an even worse position supposedly. Axel can only hope that Lord Arryn is right. At the very least Lord Hayford seems appropriately shocked and appalled by all the treachery and backstabbing they've had to deal with. In the end, once Lord Arryn has had the time to explain everything that's happened, they're not only given fresh horses but also a detachment of Hayford men to carry them the rest of the way to King's Landing and make sure they arrive safely at the gates. After what happened before, Axel is quite on edge around said men, but thankfully they don't seem to have any ill intentions. And so, only a couple hours after leaving Hayford Castle behind, they come into view of their ultimate destination. The sprawling city of King's Landing looms in the distance, and as they get ever closer, so does its smell. By the seven, that stench. From beside him, Lord Arryn lets out a mirthless bark of laughter. Apologies Axel, but you'll get used to it eventually. Fortunately, the Red Keep is kept, isolated from the rest of the city's unique aromas. Axel just wrinkles his nose, privately thinking that he'll never get used to this kind of smell. Though at least he'll have some respite if Lord Arryn is to be believed. Finally, after another full half-hour of riding, they reach the city's outer wall and the northern gate. Which is currently closed, Axel notes with narrowed eyes and budding suspicion. One of the two remaining Vale Knights rides forward and shouts at the top of his lungs. Open the gate. Lord Arryn returns. Open the gate and make way for the hand of the king. There's some shuffling atop the wall before a voice comes back down. The gate is to remain closed by order of the queen. Nobody is to come in and out of the city, no exceptions. The queen. Axel shoots a curious look over at Lord Arryn. The older man has a deep frown and a shadow cast over his features as he pushes his horse forward. Axel moves with him, staying at his side just in case another archer decides to try to put an arrow in his chest. Stopping beside the first Vale Knight, Lord Arryn is the next to call out. The queen does not have the authority to shut the gates of King's Landing. Even if she did, the orders of the king's hand would supersede them. For what reason does the queen lock down the city? It's a good question, though Axel thinks it would be better to ask it after making them open the gates. Especially since all of this hard riding and now heavy shouting can't be good for Lord Arryn. Even setting aside Axel's unnaturalness, the Lord of the Vale is much older than him and it's clear that their journey, as well as the incidents along the road, have taken their toll on the man. Not rightly sure, truth be told. They say that Lord Renly fled in the night 2 days past. City was locked down shortly after. And how do we even know you are the hand of the king, Seriously. As Lord Arryn looks increasingly done with this whole conversation, Axel leans over and whispers to him. I can scale that wall and have the gate open in less than a minute. Just give the word. Blinking, Lord Arryn looks over at him, all of his anger flowing away after a moment. Axel hadn't intended his words to seem humorous, and yet the older man lets out a chuckle all the same. I'm sure you could, Axel. But, let's shelve that idea at least for the moment. I still have something else to try. Axel simply raises an eyebrow, watching in silence as Lord Arryn reaches into his clothes and pulls out a small metal brooch in the form of a hand surrounded by a crown, holding a sword. Lifting the brooch up into the sky and letting the sun reflect off of it, the Lord of the Vale tries again. I am Jon Arryn, Lord of the Eyrie, Defender of the Vale, Warden of the East, and Hand of the King. You will open the gate and make way or I will be forced to order you apprehended and put in the black cells for a fortnight. Silence falls over the area, a heaviness in the air that leaves even Axel shifting in his saddle. He waits with bated breath, feeling like he's ready for anything and everything. If they try to kill Lord Arryn, he will stop them. If they force him to scale the wall and open the gate himself, he'll do that too. Funny, he's so ready for them to make a mess of things and force his hand that Axel is actually caught a little off guard when the gate suddenly makes a heavy clunking sound and begins to slowly open up. Blinking, he glances over to Lord Arryn, watching the other man smile and carefully pin the brooch to his chest as he lets out a sigh. Very good. It seems good sense has carried the day for once. Axel snorts in amusement at that, even as they enter the city with the men from Hayford Castle at their back. Inside, they're confronted by a number of men wearing gold cloaks. Chief among them is a stout man with a bald head, his eyes widening when he catches sight of Lord Arryn in person. Lord Hand. You have truly returned. Commander Slint. You sound surprised. A commander. Axel narrows his eyes, watching the two men converse. Commander Slint seems to be sweating just a bit, even as he shakes his head. No, my lord, of course not. It was just, there have been strange reports from both the ravens and the road. Some said you were dead. Some said you were waylaid. When we heard tell of a man bearing your brooch, we weren't sure what to believe. Judging by the thin smile on Lord Aaron's face, there's no love lost between these two men. Axel surreptitiously drops his hand to the sword sheathed at his side, even as he looks over the gold cloaks that this commander has brought with him. None of them look like they're about to attack, but then Axel hadn't been able to tell the Baratheon knights were about to attack either. He's ready this go around either way. Axel refuses to be caught off guard a third time, not after the two encounters on the road. Believe this then. An assassin attempted to poison my charge in the Eyrie. Bandits tried to ambush my charge and I on the high road. In Renly Baratheon's knights turned and stabbed my men in the back on the King's Road not 3 days' ride from here. All of them failed and now here I am with my charge safe and sound at my side. All hail Crown Prince Axel Baratheon, heir to the Iron Throne. Axel tenses up as all eyes fall upon him. Immediately, the remaining 2 Vale Knights repeat Lord Aaron's final words and only a moment later do the men from Hayford Castle do the same. Hail the Crown Prince. Hail King Robert's heir. Hail. 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 Even some of the gold cloaks get caught up in it, calling out as well as Commander Slint looks, poleaxed to say the least. Eyes wide, the bald man looks at Axel in shock for a moment before a flicker of recognition enters his beady eyes. Ah, why your majesty, you have the look of your father about you. And then, as though the initial tension hadn't happened at all, the commander immediately falls all over himself. Lord Hand, Crown Prince Baratheon, please allow me and my men to escort you to the Red Keep. The city is in disarray and while the removal of the wildfire continues unabated, everyone is in need of proper leadership once more. Please, right this way. Axel still isn't sure he trusts it, but in the end he's not going to start something based purely on feelings. He'll finish anything anyone else wants to start, but for now, there's nothing to do but follow the commander. Along their way through the streets of King's Landing, Axel learns several things. 1. He learns from the quiet whispers of Lord Arryn that the commander's full name is Commander Janos Slint and he's the current leader of the City Watch, or as Axel knows them, the Goldcloaks. 2. He learns that while it was Lord Arryn who promoted Janos Slint to his position in the first place some years back, he'd also uncovered proof of bribery and wanton corruption a little while later. Unfortunately, the proof had fallen through and Axel's father had ultimately decided to retain Slint rather than have someone potentially worse take the man's job. 3rd, separate from Lord Arryn's whispers, Axel learns that the smell of the city actually gets worse the deeper you get into it, until it feels like it's permeating not just your nostrils, but also your senses of seeing, hearing, and tasting. Indeed, Axel's eyes water a little bit from how pungent the aromas get. 4th and finally, he learns that despite the needed removal of those wildfire caches Lord Arryn had told him about, there are still quite a lot of small folk in King's Landing with entirely too much time on their hands. The hand o' the king's returned. They say that's the next king beside him. Looks just like his father, he does. The king's son. Your majesty, over here your majesty. A new ass to sit upon that spiky throne, bahaha. It's a lot. Fortunately he has Lord Arryn at his side, and the man advises him to ignore the small folk by and large. Many of them clamor for his attention, pulling his eyes in all directions. Many more just seem to clamor for the sake of clamoring. A few even jeer and throw insults at him, relying on the safety of the crowd to protect them. If he was of a mind to take issue with their words, it wouldn't of course. He picks out each of the more belligerent small folk with ease, catching them with his eyes one after the other. Many of them are incredibly drunk though, so he pays them no mind. Those that aren't drunk, well, they tend to freeze the moment he makes eye contact with them, shutting up and looking like they've pissed themselves as he rides past. In the end, between the Hayford men and the Goldcloaks, they reach the Red Keep unmolested despite the small folk that appear from the roads all around them and follow behind them in a huge growing mass. Ascending a road at a steep incline, Axel looks back and blinks, able to see not just all the way to the back of that huge grouping of small folk, but also most of the city from up here. The higher they climb, the better the smell gets too, almost as though there's a literal ocean of stench filling King's Landing and by moving up the hill, they were escaping said ocean. As they come to a stop in front of the Red Keep, Lord Arryn leans over to him and clears his throat. Might be good to say a quick word, just so they disperse easier. Right. That was probably fair. The only problem was, Axel had no fucking clue what to say. Swallowing thickly, he turns his horse and looks back over the gathered crowd. All of them fall silent once they have his full, undivided attention. Seriously though, what the fuck was he supposed to say? In the end, Axel just decides to speak from the heart. Words that have honestly been swirling around in his head for days now come bubbling to the surface. People of King's Landing. The tragic deaths of my father and my brothers will not soon be forgotten. I grieve for them and I'm sure all of you do as well. But I swear on my father's name, I swear on the crown soon to sit upon my brow, and I swear upon the seven who are one that I will be the best king to all of you that I can be, from this day until my last. There's a brief pause as Axel worries he's sounded more ridiculous than kingly. But then, a cheer erupts from the crowd, buoying his spirits and bringing a broad smile to his face. Beside him, Lord Arryn chuckles and grabs him by the shoulder, giving it a good squeeze. Well said, Axel. Well said. He's feeling good about himself after that, even as they dismount from their horses and dismiss the Hayford men back to their lands and the Goldcloaks back to their duties in the city. In the end, it's just Lord Arryn, Axel, and the last two of Lord Arryn's knights who enter the Red Keep's courtyard. They find quite the sorry reception waiting for them there. There's a bald, rotund man that Axel recognizes from Lord Arryn's descriptions as Varys the Spider, the small council's master of whispers. Then there's a tall, weedy-looking man with a smile that reminds Axel more of a rat than anything else who can only be Lord Petter Baelish, aka Littlefinger, the small council's master of coin. Tellingly, however, there is no sign of either of Axel's uncles. Stannis Baratheon, master of ships, is off on Dragonstone, where he has been since just before the king's death. Renly Baratheon, master of laws, has fled the city after trying to have Axel killed on the King's Road. Even more tellingly, Axel sees no sign of the Queen Dowager, Cersei Lannister, or the Princess Myrcella, his half-sister. Both women are completely absent from the courtyard, leaving Axel and Lord Arryn to be greeted by the tattered remains of the small council and nothing else. As Lord Varys and Lord Baelish step forward to make their introductions and pay their respects, Axel is gratified when Lord Arryn does most of the heavy lifting with the other two men. It allows him to take a step back and really recognize where he is, how far he's come. He's made it. He made it to King's Landing. Distantly, he hears Lord Arryn making demands for his coronation to take place as soon as possible, so he supposes that will be done swiftly too. Soon he'll be king of this place, no, not just of this place, but the entire Seven Kingdoms. Except, of course, it wouldn't be that simple. Not with a treacherous uncle in the wind and multiple people trying to have him killed. Funny, Lord Arryn had convinced Axel to become king specifically because he said it was the only way to prevent a war breaking out. He'd made it sound like everyone would accept Axel because all of the other options were worse. As he stands there in that rather empty courtyard, the adulation of the small folk already fading into the back of his mind, Axel can't help but wonder if anyone really wants him on the throne at all. XXX. Poor Axel. But hey, at least he finally got to King's Landing. Tomorrow's chapter will be the last of Arc 1, and then we get into Arc 2. Chapter 13. Coronation. The coronation through the eyes of one of Axel's enemies. XXX. We stand here today in the great sept of Baelor to see a new king crowned. It takes every fiber of her being not to throw a fit right then and there. This whole coronation was a ridiculous farce. It should have been her Joffrey up there. Failing that, it should have been Tommen. And failing that, it should have been Myrcella. Never mind the line of succession, better her Myrcella than another fucking Baratheon. This was the second coronation that Cersei Lannister had attended in her life. The first one had been Robert's. She'd been younger then, so much younger, and so much more excited for what her future held. After all, Robert Baratheon immediately after the rebellion had still been a handsome man and a renowned warrior. He was no Rhaegar of course, but he had seemed like a good match all the same. Her father had promised her Rhaegar when she was even younger still, but given that the man was dead, Cersei had magnanimously decided not to hold it against him. After all, she was still going to be queen and marrying Rhaegar's killer wasn't a half-bad consolation prize. Or so she'd thought. Oh what a fool she'd been. Robert had turned out to be a failure in every way that mattered. A failure of a king, a failure of a husband, and a failure of a father. And now here Cersei was, having to watch his bastard be crowned by the High Septon when it should have been one of her sons standing in his place. Many are the perils that tried to stand between him and this moment. Of course, even as the High Septon drones on, Cersei reflects that if either of her sons were still alive, they wouldn't be coronated here of all places. The Great Sept was for royal weddings, not coronations. Coronations were supposed to take place in the Red Keep before the Iron Throne. The High Septon was supposed to come to the new king, not the other way around. But apparently Robert's bastard was pious to a fault. He'd specifically asked for the coronation to take place in the Great Sept, citing his faith and the fact that the seven must have been watching over him as reasons why he simply had to be crowned beneath their gaze in the place of their worship. As such, the towering statues of the seven surround them on all sides while the Great Sept is packed to the brim with nobility and the most devout. It was enough to make her sick. It was enough to make her want to rage at the injustice and unfairness of it all. Yet here he remains all the same. Though at the same time, she had so many damn questions. Like how had he survived the strangler? It would have been one thing if he'd simply avoided the poison in some way, perhaps with Jon Arryn employing a taste tester as a sensible precaution or the like. But no. The stories out of the Eyrie, as outlandish as they might be, were quite clear and all surprisingly uniform. Robert's bastard definitely ate the poisoned meat pie. It had an understated but universally agreed upon effect on the young man. And then in front of the entire hall, her assassin had also eaten some of the pie and it had killed him in less than a minute, as the strangler was supposed to. The man she'd hired to poison Axel Stone was a smart one. Killing himself so she couldn't get to him and punish him for his failure, he'd made the right move. Obviously, she wouldn't have let him off lightly after he'd failed so spectacularly, whether Robert's bastard was somehow immune or not. May the warrior grant him courage and protect him in these perilous times. Her breath hitches and Cersei barely contains her flinch at the mention of the warrior. It wouldn't be good to react too strongly, given that she and Myrcella were placed in the front row of this coronation, effectively being used as trophies in the wake of Renly's defection and treachery. In her mind's eye, for as long as Cersei could remember, she'd likened some of the seven to people in her life. The father was her father, the mother was her mother and she was the maiden. The crone, of course, was that damnable witch from the woods. Meanwhile, the warrior was her brother. Her twin. Her other half. Even now his loss ate at her. She hadn't wanted to believe it when the news first reached her. Jaime. Dead. It wasn't possible. Even when she saw the body, she felt like she couldn't trust her own eyes. And yet, it was him. More than that, they claimed he did the deed himself. That he took his own life. There was just no way, but none of Cersei's attempts at investigating had turned up answers. She couldn't figure out who had murdered her brother, but the thought of him committing suicide just didn't make sense. And yet, he was dead and she was still alive and it didn't feel real even now. How could one side of the same coin perish while the other side persisted? Shouldn't she have been struck down the moment he drew his final breath? But no. The real world wasn't nearly so romantic. Jaime was gone and Cersei continued to exist and that was all there was to it. May the Father show him the most just and righteous path forward through the early days of his reign. Well, not all there was to it. There was still the matter of revenge. It mattered little whether or not truly Jaime took his own life. Even if he had, his death was still something that had to be avenged. A Lannister always paid their debts and the only way Cersei knew to do so was to double down and kill the Baratheons who had caused her family so much grief and heartbreak in such a short time. Alas, Renly had inadvertently escaped the noose when he'd fled in the wake of his failed treachery. It was almost enough to make Cersei laugh, thinking about it now. She had it all planned out. Commander Slynt and his goldcloaks had been paid off. Her Lannister men had been ready to raid Renly's quarters and do away with him. And if they killed the Knight of the Flowers while they were at it, so be it. A simple sacrifice all things considered. But then the sword swallower had fled. Her men had reported back hastily emptied chambers and no sign of Renly. She'd reacted swiftly, having the city shut down on her orders, but to no avail. By the next morning, Cersei had learned that the Baratheon lord and all of his men had managed to flee the city just before she'd sent the order for them to take his head. At the time, Cersei had been infuriated that her prey had escaped her grasp. She'd raged at how he'd somehow found out about her plans. Only later had she learned the truth. Renly didn't even know Cersei was aiming to end his miserable life. No, he hadn't been running from her, he'd been running from his own nephew. And may the Smith grant him the strength he needs to carry the heavy burden of leadership. It seemed Cersei wasn't the only one that wanted Robert's bastard dead. Renly had designs on the crown and thought to remove Jon Arryn and his charge from the board so that he could usurp the Iron Throne from Stannis. Given how little love was lost between Stannis and the rest of Westeros, and the fact that he'd happened to be out of the city when Robert died, it wasn't a half-bad plot. Truth be told, Cersei wished Renly's plot had succeeded where hers failed. Alas, it seemed that Axel Stone had the same luck as his damn father if he was able to survive so many attempts on his life in such a short amount of time. After all, if Renly's plan to kill Axel had worked, then he wouldn't have fled King's Landing when he did, and Cersei's plan to kill him in turn would have gone off without a hitch. From there, the only other man who she would have had to kill was Stannis Baratheon, and her vengeance would have been complete. But no, Renly was too incompetent. He clearly didn't send enough of his men. And now he had fled to the Stormlands and nobody knew what he was going to do next. Cersei couldn't imagine that the Storm Lords would stay loyal to him once word of his treachery reached their ears from King's Landing. He would have to spin quite the fanciful yarn to explain away his base treachery. All the while, Jon Arryn and Axel Stone managed to slip into King's Landing despite Cersei's orders for the city to be sealed. And once the hand of the king was officially back with Robert's blasted heir at his side, there was no stopping any of this, as much as she might have wanted to. In the light of the Seven, I now proclaim Axel of the House Baratheon, first of his name to be King of the Andals and the first men and Lord Protector of the Seven Kingdoms. Long may he reign. Long may he reign. Cersei, of course, calls out with the rest of them even as Myrcella stammers out the words at her side. Her daughter has seen better days and Cersei wishes she had more time to spend with the last of her children, truly she does. But as she watches the crown be placed down upon the brow of Robert's bastard, Cersei knows that she doesn't have that luxury. Not in the slightest. She could still make this work, after all. Axel Baratheon was as handsome as his father had been back in the day. He was also, as the reports said, far more polite and mild-mannered than Robert ever was, despite sharing Robert's size and past stature. There was no doubt in Cersei's mind that Axel's good looks and calm attitude would rally the people of King's Landing and the Crownlands to his side. Meanwhile, Jon Arryn's place as his hand would ultimately cause the other realms to fall into line as well. But Renly wouldn't give up so easily, or so Cersei hoped. If he told the right lies, maybe he would even turn the Stormlands against their new king. She wasn't holding her breath, but at the same time, she was watching carefully to see what happened next. After all, if she could get the Baratheons to war with one another, then that would help her out quite a bit in her plans for revenge. Axel could kill Renly or Renly could kill Axel, she didn't care which. And then Stannis could be brought in perhaps to kill the other one or be killed in turn. Finally, whichever of the three was left would die by Cersei's hand, or at least the hands of one of her men. A perfect ending to the male line of House Baratheon. Of course, she couldn't make sure diplomacy failed and war was inevitable from the safety of Castle Rock, now could she? Which was why, as unfortunate as it was, she'd ignored her father's letter when it finally arrived yesterday. The Lord Paramount of the Westerlands had bade her to return home and even told her to smuggle Myrcella out of King's Landing with her if she could. Jaime's death seemed to have shaken him quite badly because the Tywin Lannister that Cersei had grown up fearing would never make such a politically disadvantageous move. No, this Tywin, he was scared, Cersei could tell. He wanted her to flee King's Landing and to bring her daughter, the princess, with her. For what? Their protection. Their safekeeping. Cersei knew better. Their new king would never let her or Myrcella go that easily. Better to not even try so as to not invoke any suspicion. No, Cersei needed to find the right opportunity to whisper into the new king's ear. She needed him indebted to her. The exact way she was going to pull this off, Cersei didn't fully know yet. After all, just days before she wanted him dead more than anything in the whole world. She still did wants him dead of course, but not before she's wrung every last drop of use out of him first. There was a lot Cersei could do with a more mild-mannered version of Robert Baratheon. An awful lot. With the coronation complete, everyone begins the long trek back to the Red Keep. Normally, were the coronation to take place in front of the Iron Throne as it should have, they could have simply started the festivities right then and there while everyone paid their respects to the new king. Instead they are all forced to make their way back through the city first. Cersei and Myrcella have their own carriage, at least, where they have a moment of time to themselves. Offering her daughter a smile, Cersei glances out the window at all the watching small folk. You did well today, Myrcella. Thank you, mother. Cersei sighs. Almost over now. We'll be at the front of the line to bow and pay our respects to the new king once we get back to the throne room. Then, if you would like, you may retire to your rooms early. Myrcella jolts at this, before ducking her head. Yes, I would appreciate that very much. Much too timid. But to be fair, Cersei couldn't really blame her. Her poor daughter had lost so much in such a short period of time. And now some stranger sat his ass upon the Iron Throne. She was still a princess, still Myrcella Baratheon, but her position at this point was questionable all the same. All the more reason to get the ear of their new king as quickly as possible, Cersei supposed. For all that she wanted him dead, she still needed to keep Myrcella safe from him or his uncles until every last one of them was in the ground. With that in mind, Cersei reaches up and loosens the top of her dress a little bit, letting out a heavy sigh when Myrcella glances over at her curiously. A hot day. And being crowded by so many people in the Great Sept didn't make it any better, did it? Ah, no, mother. Myrcella loosens her own dress, but unlike Cersei, when they finally arrive back at the Red Keep, she makes sure to fix up her appearance before leaving the carriage. Cersei does not. Instead, she leaves traces of her cleavage showing, even as she walks with regal purpose alongside her last living offspring into the Red Keep. As she'd told Myrcella, they are among the first to pay their respects to the new king. In fact, as the queen and princess, they are the first. The small council will come after them, but at this point, Cersei and Myrcella are the highest-ranking nobility in the city aside from their new king. Once young Axel has taken his seat upon the Iron Throne and Jon Arryn has taken his place at his side as Hand of the King, Cersei makes her way forward, walking up the steps until she's standing right in front of Robert's bastard. Meeting his eyes, the queen bows low and makes sure he gets a hint of a view as she does so. Skilled as Cersei is, she's not sure even Lord Arryn notices what she's done, but from the flash of recognition and interest in Axel's eyes, she knows that their new king has. Giving him an ever so slight smile, Cersei rises to her feet and steps to the side. Behind her, Myrcella mimics her actions much more jerkily before quickly joining her. Cersei sends her off to her quarters with orders for the Lannister man accompanying her to retrieve food from the kitchens for the princess once she's safely back in her rooms. But Cersei lingers and watches as the tired and sad remains of the small council in the form of Varys and Baelish pay their respects next, followed by all of the nobility currently residing within King's Landing. Cersei watches all of them with her head held high in the poise, grace, and bearing of a queen. She knows how they see her, of course. She's merely a prize at this point. No longer truly the queen since Robert died, and not even the mother to the new king. If it weren't for the name, Lannister, she would be nobody to them, likely set aside and forgotten about. But because she is of House Lannister, she is a trophy, an interesting thing to look at as she haunts the new king's court like a ghost. But that's exactly what Cersei wants them all to think. Let them underestimate her. Let them disregard her. And most of all, let the games begin. XXX. Cersei is going to fuck around and find out, LMAO. Chapter 14. Renly's Plan. The start of Arc 2. Don't worry guys, Renly has a plan. XXX. You reek of desperation, Lord Baratheon. It's not a good look for you. Mother. Renly chuckles in the face of Lady Olenna's cantankerous attitude and Mace Tyrell's exasperated reaction as they all sit together in the Reachlord's solar. Fortunately Loras had prepared him well for dealing with his father and grandmother. In fact, his paramour had told him exactly how to handle both the Queen of Thorns and the Lord Paramount of the Reach. It's fine Lord Tyrell, more than fine. What is the point of experience if you are not allowed to voice it, no? He flashes a grin in Lady Olenna's direction, causing her to narrow her eyes at him. He can tell she doesn't like him but Renly doesn't mind. He's used to old women disapproving of him and his nature at this point. Besides, in Lady Olenna's case, he knows it comes from a place of love. Love, and fear, both on behalf of her family. It won't be just Mace that Renly intends to convince here, but also the Queen of Thorns. Even though Mace Tyrell is technically the ruler of the Reach and Lord of House Tyrell, it's well known that his mother has an outstated impact on his decision-making. Case in point. Mother, he wishes to make my Marjorie his queen. This is what we wanted, is it not? Surely you must see the benefits of allying ourselves with Lord Baratheon. Yes, even Lord Tyrell was already in his corner on this. But then to be fair, Renly has offered Mace everything he wanted. Not only a marriage to Lady Marjorie Tyrell, but also the position of hand once Renly sits upon the Iron Throne. Olenna lets out a loud harumph, scowling at her son as though she thinks him an idiot. She probably does if Loras is to be believed. And how exactly will he put a crown upon my granddaughter's head when he doesn't even control the throne yet? Well boy, what is your plan for taking King's Landing? You aren't even the next in line for the throne, your brother is. How exactly do you intend to not only overthrow your nephew, but also claim jump your brother? Renly smiles politely, affecting an air of patience and civility as he looks Lady Olenna right in the eye. Can't afford to show weakness here and now, not in front of a woman like her. Old she might be, but nobody would ever mistake the Queen of Thorns as weak. Unfortunately, she raises a very good point. None of this should have had to happen. If all had gone according to plan, Renly would already be sat upon the Iron Throne and it would be House Tyrell that would be coming to him instead of the other way around. He likely would have still have made Margaery his queen and Mace his hand in those circumstances given his connection with Loras, of course. However, it would have been up to the Reach to make the deal as sweet as possible. Instead, Renly was forced to come personally to bring the Reach on side so that he could make this somewhat haphazard plan of his work. I'm sure you'd rather we not mince words, Lady Olenna. My brother Stannis is not a well-liked man. Nobody is going to back him in a bid for the Iron Throne, least of all the lords of the Stormlands. Each and every one of them has chosen to support me instead. That alone should tell you who has the stronger claim between us. Olenna's eyes narrow. All of them. Hey, he's definitely caught her off guard there. The incredulity in her tone is palpable and Renly understands why even as he smirks and slowly nods. It even had the benefit of being mostly the truth. Of all the lords in the Stormlands, a good majority of them had fallen in line. Only a couple had raised issue with Renly's actions, but they had been easily silenced through intimidation and if that wasn't enough, force. At this point in time, Renly already had the entirety of the Storm Lords behind him. The Queen of Thorns' eyes narrow even further and she scowls. How? Raising an eyebrow, Renly sits back in his chair. I am Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, Lady Tyrell. My men are loyal to me. From the lords to the knights, all the way down to the small folk. Scoffing, the old woman shakes her head. You just told me you weren't going to mince words, Lord Baratheon. So tell us how you've managed to rally the Storm Lords at your back so quickly or I will be forced to name you a liar. Mother. But even as Mace groans at his mother's words, Renly can tell the somewhat simple Lord of the Reach is just as curious as his mother at this point. After all, even someone as dull and affable as Mace Tyrell can see the strangeness in what Renly is saying. It beggars disbelief to think none of the more important lords in Renly's lands would take issue with ignoring the rightful line of succession. However, that's where Renly has come up with something rather clever if he says so himself. Smiling brightly, he claps his hands and a moment later a young woman in a maid's uniform is led into the room. Both Mace and Olenna look at the woman curiously, even as she clutches at her dress and looks at the floor, refusing to meet any of their eyes. Rising from his chair, Renly moves over to the young woman, placing his hands on her shoulders and giving them a good rub. It's all right, Sarah. Lord and Lady Tyrell aren't going to hurt you, nor will they be upset with what you have to say. Please, tell them what you and your sisters told me. Haltingly, slowly, the woman does exactly that. Forgive me, my lord, milady. Me and my sisters, we was assigned to the Red Keep, we was. On when the king was found after the big blast o' wildfire, he was brought back to the keep. We looked after him. Tended to him in his final moments. As she speaks, Renly carefully watches his audience for their reactions. Mace has a look of pity and secondhand disgust on his face as he no doubt imagines what the maid had to go through, what state Robert had been in by that point. Olenna is clearly intrigued, leaning forward and pursing her weathered lips together. And, get to the point, girl. Sarah jolts at the older woman's sharp tone, but Renly just whispers soothing words in her ear, still massaging her shoulders. Until finally, she manages to stammer it out. The king, milady, the king's lips were melted together. His face were half burnt off, it was, and he couldn't make any noises. His fingers were crushed, he couldn't write any letters. Milady, milord, Lord Hand lied. He lied about the king legitimizing his bastard, he did. Mace sits back in his chair floored by this reveal, eyes wide in disbelief and yet, he also believes it immediately. Olenna is more reserved in her reaction, humming even as Renly pulls Sarah back a step and turns her to face him, smiling at her as he looks her in the eyes. Very good, Sarah. Very good. Please, step out now. Thank you for your time, you've done very well. Lower lip wobbling, the maid nevertheless manages a tepid smile as she nods and leaves the room. Once she's gone, Renly takes his seat once more, and smiles broadly. Both of her sisters will tell the same story. Robert may have survived the initial blast of wildfire thanks to Sir Semley's truly heroic sacrifice, but my brother did not survive in a state that left him capable of speech or indeed any form of communication. I'm afraid to say he died in pain and agony, unable to voice his last thoughts or his final will as king. Letting his smile drop, Renly leans forward and slams a fist on the table in front of him. Lord Arryn is a liar hiding behind a reputation as an honorable and just hand of the king. I won't deny that Axel Stone is Robert's bastard, everyone knew he had one in the Vale. But that's just it. Axel was raised in the Vale. Raised by Lord Arryn and his men. With this maneuver, the hand of the king has put his own puppet on the throne. The true Baratheon dynasty will end with my brother if I don't do anything about it. Looking between Mace and Olenna, Renly lets out a shuddering breath. Straightening up and squaring his shoulders, he smiles thinly. That is why I've already sent letters by Raven to the rest of the Seven Kingdoms detailing what you both just learned. That is why I cannot simply stand aside. That, Lady Olenna, is why the Stormlands stand behind me. And that is why, with or without you, we will march on King's Landing within the fortnight, before Lord Arryn can convince the rest of the realm to ride to their defense. If we can remove his puppet from the Iron Throne before anyone else can react, then we still have a chance of salvaging things. Nobody will truly object if I take the Iron Throne. Not once they hear what Jon Arryn has done. Here. Mace Tyrell, of course, is completely sold on the whole story. The Lord Paramount of the Reach has a wide grin on his face, his passions inflamed by Renly's words, just as intended. His mother the Queen of Thorns, however, is less swayed. Well, I hope if you have to parade that girl out to tell her story again, you'll have coached her to tell better lies. And I suppose we'll have to hope the rest of the Lords of the Seven Kingdoms are too blinded by their own greed to read between the lines of those letters you sent out. Mother. This time, Mace stands from his chair, looking shocked and appalled by his mother's drawled, acidic words and acerbic tones. But Olenna is unfazed by her son's grandstanding, instead staring Renly down directly. Renly just smiles and decides to change tact. Your Marjorie has recently reached her 20th year, hasn't she? Mace flinches and Olenna narrows her eyes. Renly just shrugs. Rather old to still be unwed and without child. But then, we all know why that is. You'd hoped to wed her to Joffrey, no. But Cersei stonewalled you at every turn and Robert let it happen. It was probably one of the biggest topics of gossip in King's Landing these past few years before the tragic loss of the king and both of his sons. Renly, of course, knew more about the Tyrell side of thing than most thanks to Loras, but he also knew about other parts as well thanks to his place on the small council and whatnot. Put bluntly, a combination of factors had kept Joffrey Baratheon from being wed to any of the realm's many eligible maidens for years past the time when it normally would have happened. First, there was Cersei Lannister. The queen had been quietly but intensely opposed to her son marrying anyone for any reason whatsoever. Then, there was the king himself. From what Renly knew, Robert wanted Joffrey to marry Sansa Stark, Lord Eddard Stark's eldest daughter. But even though Sansa was almost 20 years of age herself and still unwed even at this point, the marriage had never materialized due to the long chill in Robert and Lord Stark's friendship. Many lords had put forward their daughters to wed Prince Joffrey over the years. All had found their efforts to find a way into the royal family stymied by this or that. Most had given up and married their daughters off to others, but a few remained even now. There were the two most obvious contenders, of course. One was Marjorie Tyrell of House Tyrell, 20 years of age. The second was Sansa Stark of House Stark, 19 years of age. And then there were a pair of even odder ducks. Arianne Martell of House Martell down in Dorne was 22 years old. Her father wasn't hoping to marry her to Joffrey though, instead she was said to be rather willful and that had chased away any would-be suitors. Though the Prince of Dorne might try to marry her off to Axel if Renly didn't manage to seize the Iron Throne, seeing as he knew for a fact that Axel had no Lannister blood in him. And finally, both last and probably least, there was Asha Greyjoy over on the Iron Islands. She was the daughter to a Lord Paramount and unwed despite being 23 years of age. Of course, she was almost certainly not still a maiden given that she was said to be captain of her own ship. On top of that, she was Ironborn. The Ironborn did things differently to say the least, but even Balon Greyjoy might be tempted to throw his daughter at Axel Baratheon if he thought he had a chance of getting an in with the untested king. Either that or he would start another rebellion, but Renly doubted that given how badly he got smacked down on the last one. Regardless, all of this was to say, despite being the daughter of a Lord Paramount, Marjorie Tyrell really only had two options left to her at this point in time. Him, or Axel. Every other outcome would be subpar at best, and a stain on House Tyrell's honor at worst. Smiling at Olenna, Renly gives the Queen of Thorns a knowing look. You could perhaps try to get my illegitimate nephew to marry Marjorie, of course. But you have to wonder if Lord Arryn will allow that or if he'll push for Sansa Stark given his close ties to her house. Meanwhile, if the Reach chooses to back my claim to the Iron Throne, I'm guaranteeing your daughter a crown. I will happily marry her before we even take King's Landing, and once I sit upon the Iron Throne, she will rule by my side, as Queen of the Seven Kingdoms. Sitting back in his chair, Renly spreads his arms apart. The choice is yours, really. Gamble that you can somehow slip Marjorie in under Lord Arryn's nose, or take the sure thing and side with me. Olenna frowns at him, and Renly can tell that she's not entirely convinced. And yet, she doesn't stop her son from speaking up either. Well, when you put it like that, it seems obvious, doesn't it? Besides, this isn't simply about what House Tyrell gains out of all of this is about righting a wrong and correcting an injustice. I've always thought of Lord Arryn as an honorable, stalwart man. To find out that he would lie like this all in an effort to seize more power for himself, unthinkable. We can't let this stand. Renly smiles as he and Mace both stand and shake hands. All the while, Olenna looks on with an unhappy, sour expression on her face. But for all her influence, sharp wit, and acerbic tongue, she's still just an old woman grasping at relevance. He would have liked to have convinced her to give her full support, but even just making the Queen of Thorns hold her tongue was a win in the end. Fortunately for Olenna, Renly has no intentions of losing. He'll do everything he's promising to do. He'll marry Marjorie and make Mace his hand. He'll elevate House Tyrell further than they've been elevated since Aegon's conquest turned them from stewards into lords. All the Queen of Thorns has to do is sit back and not interfere, and her house will rise farther than ever before. XXX. Well, I didn't say he had a good plan, did I? Chapter 15. Lies and Slander. Axel is settling into his new role as king. XXX. A few days have passed since his coronation, but it all still feels so surreal to Axel. Every day he wakes up not just as a Baratheon instead of a stone, but also as the king of the seven fucking kingdoms and the protector of the goddamn realm. Not everything was perfect though, unfortunately. His uncle Renly was still at large, and none of the ravens that his hand has sent to the Stormlands about bringing their Lord Paramount to justice had received an answer yet. Might just be a matter of time, but it felt a little ominous to Axel despite Lord Arryn's assurances that the Stormlands would not all side with Renly against him. Or rather, not Lord Arryn but Jon. That's what he'd been told to call his hand with increasing frequency over the past few days. Now that Axel was king, apparently the old rules didn't apply to him anymore. Instead of Lord Arryn denoting respect like it would coming from anyone else, it denoted a distance and gap between the new king and his hand that shouldn't exist. Basically, Axel wasn't just allowed to call him Jon, he was pretty much required to for the good of the realm. On top of Renly's bullshit, Axel also had issues that were closer to home. Like his Kingsguard, for example. The Kingsguard were a long and storied cohort, an elite group of 7 knights who were supposed to be the greatest and strongest warriors in all of Westeros. Their duty was simple: protect the royal family, but most importantly the king, from all harm. Given that 3 out of 5 members of the royal family had been down there in the catacombs when the wildfire had gone off, 4 out of 7 of the Kingsguard had been with them as well. Esser Mandon Moore, Esser Boros Blunt, Esser Preston Greenfield, and last but certainly not least, Esser Barristan Selmy, the Kingsguard's Lord Commander. All 4 knights had perished in the same wildfire that ultimately took the lives of the king and princes. Afterwards, though nobody could quite give Axel an explanation of why, the infamous Kingslayer Esser Jaime Lannister had also thrown himself off of the highest point of the Red Keep. This left the Kingsguard down to just 2 men, Esser Aris Oakheart and Esser Meryn Trant. Axel had sparred with both knights after being crowned king, and while he hadn't said it out loud, he found Esser Trant's skills quite lacking. Esser Oakheart wasn't half bad, but he also couldn't really do anything to overcome Axel's inherent advantages. Axel could tell that neither man had been too happy to be bested by their king. However, they hadn't tried to argue with him when he assigned them to look after Queen Dowager and Princess instead of himself. Meryn for Cersei Lannister and Aris for Myrcella Baratheon. They were better placed there anyways, because obviously Axel didn't actually need their protection. Though it still wouldn't do to have the Kingsguard depleted for too long, at least according to Jon. That was why Axel had spent the mornings since his coronation sparring with other knights who were staying in either the Red Keep or King's Landing at large, basically, interviewing, to fill the 5 empty slots. He didn't quite know how he was going to decide yet. But between that, making sure he prayed at the Great Sept of Baelor each day, and holding court for a couple of hours here and there with Jon at his side, Axel certainly had a far more structured schedule than he'd had back in the Eyrie. It's as he's coming off a one such sparring session, barely having broken a sweat and frankly not even winded, that Axel finds himself approached by one of the Red Keep's staff. "Your Majesty, a moment if it pleases you." Raising an eyebrow, Axel stops and nods. "Speak. The Lord Hand has requested your presence in the small council chambers, my king. He is with the other members of the small council as well." "Huh. All right then." Jon had told Axel that his father didn't attend many meetings of the small council during his reign, and at first he'd thought that seemed rather silly. That is, until he'd attended the first himself. Maybe it was because they were missing the Master of Laws and Master of Ships at the moment, but Axel just did not have the patience for Pycelle's stuttering and stammering, Baelish, slick wordplay, or Varys, needless obfuscations. He didn't even think it was their fault necessarily, it was just how the three men were. Jon assured him they were the best men for their roles too, so in the end all Axel could really do was tell Jon to handle the small council in his stead but call for him any time it was really important. Like now, apparently. Of course, lead the way. The young king follows the servant through the Red Keep's halls, girding himself for more not so subtle bootlicking from Lord Baelish, probing from Lord Varys, and the ramblings of a doddering old fool from Grandmaster Pycelle. However, what he doesn't prepare himself for, is Jon Arryn the angriest that Axel has ever seen him. Indeed, the moment Axel steps into the chamber, his hand looks up at him with an expression of pure wrath on his face, snarling. "Before anything else, know that this is a pack of lies, Axel. Lies and slander." Axel just blinks, a little confused as he moves further into the room. Baelish is the one to provide an answer to the burning question that Jon's words provoke. "Your uncle Renly has sent a message by Raven, Your Majesty. And from the looks of it, he's sent it to everyone in the Seven Kingdoms." Well, that didn't sound good. Axel snorts derisively as he moves and takes his chair at the head of the table. "I suppose it's too much to hope he confessed his crimes and begged for forgiveness and clemency in this letter." Varys gives him a condescending smile at that, though honestly Axel thinks the spider's default facial expression is just like that really. "I'm afraid not, Your Majesty. The Lord of Storm's End has, well, he has made some rather damaging accusations. About Lord Arryn, and your claim to the throne." Axel furrows his brow and looks to Jon. Letting out a sigh, his hand runs a hand down his face before finally explaining properly. "Renly is claiming that he has 3 maids from the Red Keep who saw Robert on his deathbed after he was retrieved from the rubble. He doesn't dispute that your father survived the explosion thanks to Esser Selmy's sacrifice, but these maids of his, he claims that all of them tended to Robert and are willing to testify before the 7 who are one that the king was incapable of speech or writing in his final hours." Before Axel can fully process this, Pycelle decides to speak up, unfortunately, stroking his long beard all the while. Which means, "I'm afraid, that he claims the late king did not in fact legitimize you and name you heir. And that Lord Arryn lied in order to put you on the throne ahead of your 2 uncles." Throwing the Grandmaster a glance, Axel looks back to Jon, and frowns harder. Actually, he thinks he feels something igniting in his chest at those words. Anger. Rage. Fury. How dare he? The members of the small council all tense up as Axel rises from his chair, hands curling into fists at his side. It would be one thing for him to come after me. But to disparage Lord Arryn's honor like that. After decades of leal service to the realm. The Lord of the Vale is above reproach. He would never lie about something like this. This slander cannot stand. Funnily enough, in the face of Axel's indignation, some of Jon's own fury seems to fade away. Instead, the older man just looks tired as he offers a wan smile. "Thank you, my king. Your words mean quite a lot. But this does not surprise me. He had to do something after his rather blatant attempt to have us killed on the Kingsroad failed so spectacularly. Still, this unfortunately explains why there has been no response from the Stormlands to our missives regarding their lord's crimes." Varys nods at that. Yes. My little birds have been hunting for answers, but I'm ashamed to admit that there wasn't enough time to find out what was going on before this letter arrived. Still, it explains quite a bit. Lord Renly, for all his treachery, is well liked by the lords of the Stormlands. With this lie, he has given them a reason to rally behind him and work to put him on the Iron Throne. I imagine what few dissenters there might have been have already been dealt with accordingly and more loyal men have been put in their place. HMPH. Just more for his uncle to answer for. Axel honestly wants to march out there right now, run down to the Stormlands, and find Renly Baratheon. Then, he'd beat the older man black and blue with his fists before taking him into custody. He wouldn't want to stoop to kinslaying, but by the 7 it would feel good to be able to put his hands on Renly right now and demand to know why his uncle was such a traitorous bastard. Unfortunately, he can't do that. Not without inviting more questions than he or Jon wants to answer at this point in time. Clearing his throat, Lord Baelish speaks up. There's a matter of how the rest of the 7 kingdoms will respond to this, of course. The coronation was a bit rushed, so we haven't even received many vows of fealty by Raven just yet, save for those of the Crownlands. Renly is clearly hoping to preempt the news of our young king's coronation with this letter, trying to sow discord and rebellion against the crown by giving everyone a reason to put him on the throne instead. Frowning, Axel grabs the back of his chair, voicing his own opinion. He'll be disappointed, won't he? The Storm Lords might rally behind him, but who else would come to his side? When the members of his small council, including even his hand, all share looks at that, Axel's stomach drops. Jon had told him people wanted him as king, for fuck's sake. Why was he here if everyone, even his own family, were going to be so fucking disloyal? After a moment of silence, Varys speaks up first. Well, at the very least, I do not believe Stannis Baratheon will accept Renly's bid for the throne. Even if Renly's lies were to be believed, Stannis would be next in line for the throne. Not him. The only question will be whether Lord Stannis supports you or decides to stay out of it. Jon slaps his hand down on the table. You can count on the Vale without question at the very least, Your Majesty. As well as the Riverlands and the North besides. There isn't a doubt in my mind that Lord Tully and Lord Stark will recognize your claim and not only bend the knee but also answer the call when they find out what Renly is trying to do. Petyr Baelish clears his throat at that. Unfortunately, that becomes a matter of time and resources. The North is far away despite the men Lord Stark could call to arms. The Riverlands is a fair distance as well. And the Vale, for all that it is my home as much as it's yours Lord Arryn, does not match the number of men that the Stormlands can call upon. Especially not if the Reach joins them. Axel jolts at that, even as a shadow falls over Jon's face. The Reach. You think House Tyrell will side with my uncle against me? Offering an awkward smile, Baelish shrugs. Well, I'd say it's a safe bet, Your Majesty. Everyone knows of the deep and lasting friendship between Renly Baratheon and Loras Tyrell. If the Knight of Flowers has any pull over his family at all, then they are likely to let your uncle worm his way into their good graces. Especially with these claims of his. At his side, Varys nods along. Lord Baelish speaks true, I'm afraid. It's safest to assume that the Stormlands and Reach will join together on this. And even if nobody else joins their cause, they are the closest to King's Landing and will have something of a head start in gathering their levies. Well shit. Axel frowns, thinking for a long moment. What about the Iron Islands and Dorne? The small council all share looks at that, until finally a tired-sounding Jon answers the question. They're likely to take a wait-and-see approach, no matter how craven such a decision would be. The Ironborn have long detested as so-called mainlanders and Dorne is forever the thorn in the soul of the 7 kingdoms. They won't support Renly at least, but they also won't be moved to try and stop him. Well damn. That tracked with what Axel knew about those 2 kingdoms, he supposed. But then wasn't there also? There is, of course, House Lannister to be considered. Lord Tywin will almost certainly voice his support, given that his daughter and granddaughter still reside within these walls. For once, Pycelle's interjection isn't a total waste of time. Axel nods thoughtfully. Yes, and the Westerlands are fairly close to King's Landing as well, aren't they? If anyone is going to be able to reinforce us in time, it will be them. Admittedly, he had yet to talk with the Queen Dowager since arriving in King's Landing and being crowned king. It had only been a few days though to be fair. But even still, Cersei Lannister had been conspicuously absent whenever she might have been present. Hell, he'd even met the princess once by this point. Myrcella Baratheon was an incredibly quiet, shy young woman who was clearly still grieving the deaths of her father and brothers. Axel had kept their conversation brief, deducing that she was a little afraid of him for some reason and not wanting to cause her any more pain than she was already in. He'd been avoiding paying her too much attention to give her time to breathe ever since. But Cersei could be the key to all of this. A letter from her was sure to sway Lord Tywin far more than a letter from any of them, right? I will go speak with Cersei Lannister. A ripple of shock runs through the small council, eyes widening even as Jon is the one to voice their apparent concern. I'm not sure if that's the best idea, Your Majesty. The Queen Dowager can be prickly at the best of times. And she and Robert had something of a contentious relationship as well. She might not appreciate a personal touch from you. Frowning, Axel shakes his head. I am the king, aren't I? I have to at least try. Even if it means getting down on my knees and begging, I'll do it. Jon looks even more alarmed by that, but Axel's mind is already made up. Without another word, he turns on his heel and strides out of the chamber, heading straight for the Queen Dowager's quarters. He's not really worried for himself or even his kingship. But he'll be damned if he's going to let Renly get away with this shit unopposed. And maybe if he can get the Lannister armies to King's Landing fast enough, they combined with the forces from the Crownlands can hold Renly at bay long enough for the Vale and Riverlands to reach the city as well. From there, the numbers will start to fall in their favor and maybe they can even end this without too much bloodshed if Renly's lords see the writing on the wall and turn on him. All Axel has to do to make that a reality is convince his father's widow to help him. How hard can that be? How hard indeed. Hey, in the interest of setting expectations now, Cersei will only be a major part of the second arc of this story. She won't stick around forever for those who can't stand her, and sorry to those who would want her to. Reminder. You can find the full 122 chapters of this story under the title The Unyielding Stag written by me on questionablequesting.com, hntai foundry.com, archiveofourown.com, and scribblehub.com.